Good evening, friends. Tonight, we wander into a world where myths stretch like soft shadows across marble columns, where music drifts like dust over sun-warmed stone, and where even the most legendary war in ancient Greece might have had an oddly musical twist. Take a breath. Let your shoulders relax. Let your mind slow down, like honey dripping from a spoon. And now, let's talk olives. Imagine you're sitting under a crooked olive tree on a mild afternoon in an ancient Aegean courtyard. The breeze is slow, not lazy, just deliberate. You've got time. Somewhere nearby, a cicada begins its tiny, buzzing solo. Off in the distance, someone's trying to tune a lyre. Badly. The olive tree, gnarled, proud, probably gossiping with nearby grapevines, has been standing there for centuries. Its roots wind like sleepy snakes through the dusty soil. And its olives? Oh, they're tough little things. Not sweet, not juicy, just sort of bitter, like a mood after a missed nap. But the Greeks loved them anyway. They pressed them into oil. They used that oil to light their lamps, slick their hair, even anoint wrestlers who glisten dramatically under the Mediterranean sun. Imagine trying to grip an oiled-up wrestler named Demetrios during a match. It's like trying to hug a wet eggplant. Anyway, our story tonight doesn't really begin with an olive, but it likes to pretend it does. The Greeks were good at that, pretending one thing symbolized another. A wooden horse could be a gift or a trap. A lyre could be an instrument or a secret. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Chapter 1. The Olive Pit and the Lyre. Let's go back. Farther. To the time of King Priam, ruler of Troy, a city that may or may not have existed quite the way Homer described it. But let's not wake the historians. The city of Troy was said to be tall-walled, sea-swept, and filled with odd little contradictions. For instance, some say it had beautiful gardens filled with singing birds. Others insist it stank like goat feet and burnt barley. Personally, I like to believe it was both, like walking through a bakery that shares a wall with a sock store. In Troy, the war had dragged on for 10 long years. Imagine that. 10 years of waiting, watching, fighting, and arguing over things like how many olives belong in a stew. You'd think after a decade, everyone would be too tired to care. But no, the Greeks were patient. They were stubborn, and a little theatrical. Enter Odysseus, trickster, storyteller, perhaps the original dad joke enthusiast of the Aegean. He had an idea. What if, he mused one quiet night, while someone was overcooking lentils, we just leave? There was silence. Maybe someone dropped a roasted figure. And another warrior asked. We build a horse, Odysseus added. Another pause. Like, to ride away on? No, a big wooden one. And we hide inside it. This was met with thoughtful chewing sounds. Possibly someone choked on a grape. But eventually, they agreed. The Trojan Horse idea, famously weird and slightly theatrical, was born. But here's the part the songs don't tell you. Some versions, rare, dusty versions in neglected scrolls, suggest there was something else hidden in that horse. Something unexpected. A lyre. Not a magical one. Not cursed. Just a lyre. An instrument. As harmless as a harp left out in the rain. So what was it doing in there? Let's imagine together. The warriors inside the wooden horse were nervous. They were cramped. Sweaty. At least one had eaten onions for dinner. And they needed something. Not strategy. Not swords. But music. And so, someone, a young man named Phareus, maybe, who always carried his lyre just in case, began to strum. Softly. Aimlessly. Just a pastime. A pluck here. A chord there. The wood of the horse hummed gently with each note, like a whisper through the belly of a beast. And down below, the Trojans, celebrating their victory, heard it too. Was it the creak of old wood? Or was it a song? They argued. Of course they did. Arguments were the national pastime. One said, it's just the wind. Another insisted, no, that's music. The gods are singing. Someone tried to dance. Someone else tripped over an amphora. Meanwhile, inside the horse, Phareus kept playing. Not because he was bold. Not because he was trying to fool anyone. But because music was all he had. It was comforting. Familiar. Like humming to yourself when you're stuck in traffic, or hiding in an enormous wooden sculpture while waiting to invade a city. You know, everyday stuff. That's the thing about Greek myths. They're full of enormous gestures, but tiny, human habits. Someone always scratches their nose at the wrong moment. Someone always forgets the goat's name. And someone, somewhere, always plays music to make the silence feel less lonely. And as for that lyre, some say it belonged to Orpheus once. Others think it was carved from olive wood taken from Athena's sacred grove. But honestly, it was probably just built by a guy named Nikos whose workshop smelled of beeswax and old wine. So what's the connection here between music and the horse? Well, we're only just beginning. But the idea of using music, gentle, sleepy, disarming music, inside a tool of war, it says something, doesn't it? That even in the middle of conflict, the Greeks couldn't help but bring a little melody along for the ride. And now, let your mind settle like dust over old parchment. Picture that enormous wooden horse, moonlit and quiet, rolling on wheels through the gates of a city that thought the war was over. And inside, not just warriors, but music, soft, warm, boring even, perfect for sleep. Now picture it with me. That massive wooden horse creaking through the gates of Troy, its wheels groaning over worn stone, while the last rays of daylight blink drowsily behind distant hills. The city is still recovering from a celebration, the kind of raucous, overdone festivity you throw when you're not entirely sure what you're celebrating anymore. Somewhere, a flute lies forgotten on a windowsill. Someone's sleeping with their face in a bowl of lentil porridge. And in the quietest part of the city, beneath torchlight flickering like fireflies, a group of elders is arguing about whether the horse should be placed near the temple or the market. It's art, one of them declares, gesturing with a fig roll. It's clutter, mutters another. We don't need more wooden animals. Remember the owl incident. Meanwhile, inside the horse, things are less philosophical. Phareus, the accidental lyrist, has stopped playing. Not because he wants to, but because his fingers are starting to cramp. You try sitting cross-legged for hours next to a guy who snores like a thunderstorm through a tunnel and see how long your focus holds. He shifts. A creak. Someone gasps. Everyone freezes. But no footsteps come. No alarms sound. Just the gentle crackle of a distant brazier and the occasional donkey hawing like it's auditioning for a choir of misfits. So Phareus does what anyone would do in that moment. He quietly munches a sesame cake. Crumbly. Slightly stale. It's not victory food, but it's something. That's when a thought, one he's had before, creeps back into his mind. What if this whole plan is really, really dumb? Think about it. You've just spent 10 years fighting a war over a kidnapped queen, who may or may not have wanted to be kidnapped. You've lost friends, sandals, spoons. You've aged. Your best tunic has a stain shaped like a dolphin, and no one knows how it got there. And now, you're hiding in a horse, next to a guy whose armor squeaks when he breathes, hoping the enemy doesn't notice you smell like sardines and regret. He almost laughs. Almost. But instead, he plucks a single note. A low one. Soft. Barely audible. Like the sound a pebble makes when it rolls into a cave and decides to stay there. That's the note that stirs something ancient. Not divine. Not magical. Just deeply familiar. Music, for the Greeks, wasn't just entertainment. It was ritual. It was medicine. It was how you told a story when your voice had too many emotions tangled in it. Even the gods had their playlists. Apollo played the lyre. Pan favored the pipes. Dionysus preferred drunken chants and the rhythmic clinking of wine goblets. And Hermes, cheeky rascal that he was, once built an instrument out of a tortoise shell and some sheep guts. Inventive? Yes. Hygienic? Debatable. And so, this little pluck inside this wooden horse wasn't just a note. It was a thread, one that connected back through time, through temples and taverns and smoky fireside gatherings, to the earliest lullabies hummed by mothers whose names are long forgotten. Phareus didn't know that. He just liked how the note felt in his fingers. Outside, the Trojans, those eternally suspicious citizens, were still talking. I'm telling you, I heard something. Athena sneezed again. It's a sign. No, it's the wind. Or that annoying piper kid who won't stop practicing outside my window. In the courtyard, a stray dog sniffed the horse and walked away unimpressed. And above, on a balcony overlooking the scene, a young Trojan girl named Euryale tossed dried flower petals into the breeze. She wasn't interested in war, or victory, or statues. She just liked the way the petals swirled, like dancing colors with no rhythm but the wind. She leaned forward, squinting at the horse. Odd, she whispered. That thing hums. Her brother, who was trying to balance a honey cake on his knee, shrugged. So do frogs. Doesn't mean they're sacred, but the hum lingered. A musical note that wasn't quite a melody, but wasn't not one either. Just a presence. A vibration that tickled the air like warm breath on cool glass. Meanwhile, back inside the horse, someone, probably Menelaus, whispered, "Do you have to keep playing that thing?" Phareus didn't answer. Not out of rudeness, but because he was imagining the fields back home, the ones just past the olive groves, where his sister used to sing while picking wild leeks. Her voice would lift, strong and untrained, and the lyre would follow, like a sleepy duckling. He missed that. The war hadn't taken her, just time. She had married, moved inland, disappeared into the usual rhythms of life. But her song stayed with him. That's why he played. That's why he carried the lyre. Not for glory, not for show, but to remember. And in that moment, curled up inside history's most impractical war strategy, he felt, oddly, at peace. Outside, the Trojans yawned. The wind cooled. Someone suggested putting out the lamps early, and the horse, large and silent and humming with possibility, waited. Now let your breath ease. Let your thoughts flutter, leaf-like, through that moonlit city. Picture the petals falling, the dog curling up in a corner, the young girl wondering why something so big could sound so soft. We'll return to them soon. But for now, night settled on Troy the way powdered sugar settles on a cake. Soft, slow, and barely there until you notice everything is covered in it. The stars blinked lazily overhead, half listening to the city's breathing. Somewhere, a loom clacked gently as an old woman finished weaving a blanket of dull purple wool. Not her best work, but it was warm, and she was tired. In the distance, an amphora tipped over and cracked. Not from battle, just a clumsy cat chasing shadows across a cluttered balcony. The war was, supposedly, over. And inside the wooden horse, among the cramped limbs and rustling cloaks, the warriors began to drift into something that was almost sleep, but not quite. That nervous, twitchy rest that comes when you know you'll need to leap into action but haven't been told when. Odysseus was awake. Of course he was. The man could sleep through a siren's song and still dream of tax strategies. But tonight, he had things to consider. Plans, variables, and gas. No one talks about that part of the horse. The fact that it was filled with warriors on a diet of salted fish, lentils, and anxiety. Let's just say, the ventilation system was not state-of-the-art. He shifted slightly, elbowing someone who might have been Ajax, or might have been a stack of tunics. "Who's playing the lyre?" he whispered. "Phareus," someone else whispered back, probably through a scarf. Odysseus grunted. "Tell him to stop. He'll ruin the element of surprise." A long pause, then a quieter voice. "Honestly, it's kind of nice. Calms the nerves." Odysseus said nothing, but his silence sounded a lot like reluctant agreement. Meanwhile, Phareus continued. Not boldly, not dramatically, just quietly, as if each note were a pebble dropped into a pond of silence. It wasn't a song anyone recognized, not even him. Just a wandering collection of sounds, like someone telling a story in a language no one really speaks anymore, but everyone somehow understands. Outside, the Trojans lit their last torches for the night. The city fell into the hush that only comes after celebration, a kind of sacred stillness, like the pause after a joke no one got, but everyone politely nodded at. And up in her room, Eurale, the girl with the flower petals and the wandering eyes, was still awake. She was supposed to be asleep, but instead, she was watching the wooden horse from her balcony. She'd tied a few petals to a thread and was dangling it over the edge like a fishing line, just to see how long the breeze would hold it. She swore she could hear the horse singing. Not loud, not even with words, just a hum, like when someone you love hums while sweeping the floor. She whispered to her brother, who was now face first in a pillow, drooling like a leaky wineskin. "It's too big to be quiet." The horse, in her mind, was not just a statue or a gift. It was a mystery, and mysteries made her feel less sleepy. Back inside the horse, Diomedes was chewing what might have once been a figure. It was hard to tell anymore. You ever think about what happens if they just burn this thing? There was a collective hush. "Thanks," groaned Menelaus. "Now that's all I'll think about." "I mean, we're made of wood," Diomedes added helpfully. "It's what I'd do. Big creepy sculpture shows up at my gate. Torch it. Phareus plucked a sarcastic little sting on the lyre, like a musical eye roll. But the truth is, it wasn't that far-fetched. The Trojans had considered it. They had meetings about it. Lengthy ones, with scrolls and diagrams and impromptu wine breaks. One priest, Laocoon, had stood before the horse and shouted, "This thing is a trap." He even threw a spear at it. Dramatic, poetic, possibly fueled by 3 cups of mead. But then, according to myth, sea serpents came out of nowhere and ate him. Which, you have to admit, really killed the vibe. People said, well, if the gods sent serpents to silence him, the horse must be holy. And just like that, everyone stopped asking questions. Back to music. Phareus, unaware that his gentle strumming was now part of a much larger existential tapestry, started plucking a familiar tune. Something from childhood. Something so simple it barely had a name. It was the kind of melody that felt like warm bread smells. Simple, unassuming, comforting. Odysseus finally muttered, "Fine, let him play. But if he starts singing, I'm biting my shield." No one did. But they all listened. Not just to the lyre, but to the silence around it. The way the notes filled the cracks between breath and heartbeat. The way it gave shape to the nothingness. Like drawing faces in fogged-up glass. Outside, a breeze stirred. Light, cool, almost musical itself. And across the city, in kitchens and courtyards, in stables and sleeping chambers, people dreamed. Not of battle, not of victory, but of olives, and wine, and the strange, haunting hum of a horse that wasn't quite silent. The kind of dreams you forget the moment you wake, but carry in your bones the rest of the day. So now, as you rest beneath your blanket or press your cheek gently to the pillow, let your breath mirror the rhythm of the lyre. Slow, steady, curious. Let yourself imagine the city of Troy, lit by soft torchlight, humming with strange secrets and the music of a soldier who just didn't know how to stop. And somewhere inside that enormous horse, someone smiles in the dark. Have you ever noticed how, just before sleep, the mind wanders into odd places? Not just daydreams, but peculiar little memory corners. The sound a wicker chair made on your grandmother's porch. The smell of roasted chestnuts near a market stall that closed years ago. The way a song, played faintly in the distance, can slip into your dreams without asking permission. That's the kind of night Troy was having. The kind of night when all the city's usual edges, its politics, its grief, its stubbornness, softened. Just a bit. Just enough for imagination to sneak in. Let's float now to the roof of the Temple of Apollo. It's quiet up here. Cool wind. Chipped marble. The occasional sleepy pigeon ruffling its feathers like it's trying to remember how to be majestic. Below, the wooden horse stands in the courtyard. An object of fascination, of ritual, of unresolved questions. But not everyone was asleep. Down near the stables, a man named Melanix, an elderly night watchman with one good eye and a poor sense of boundaries, was on patrol. He wasn't particularly skilled. He was mostly there for company, and because he had an impressive collection of excuses. As he shuffled past the massive horse, he paused. Not because he suspected anything, but because he thought he heard plucking. "Is that a cricket?" he muttered, scratching his beard, which resembled a burnt broom. He leaned in. Could be a cricket with a lute? He squinted, sniffed the air, yawned with commitment, then wandered off toward the wine cellar, just in case the noise was coming from a misplaced amphora of song wine. Spoiler, it wasn't. Inside the horse, Phareus had fallen into that strange trance musicians often find. Not performance, not practice, just presence. He didn't play for the others anymore. He played for the space between things. The space between moments. Between the breath and the hush. And in the half-dark belly of the horse, no one stopped him. Even Odysseus had given up trying to grumble. He sat with his back against the wooden frame, eyes closed, counting each pluck like steps down a very sleepy staircase. You see, ancient Greek music wasn't like today's music. It didn't rush. It didn't demand. It just was. A slow drip. A wind-bent reed. A lullaby for the air itself. No harmony. No chords. Just one note after another, like pearls strung on a lazy string. And for the soldiers who had spent years locked in war, it was odd. This softness. This slowness. It reminded some of home. Others of lovers. And at least one man of a goat he once had who danced whenever someone played a reed flute. The goat's name was Cabbage. let's not dwell. Back in the city, a gentle rain began to fall. Not a storm, just the kind of rain that whispers. Taps on clay rooftops. Coils and puddles like forgotten silver bracelets. Urale, still on her balcony, tilted her face toward the drizzle. She whispered, "Now it sings in the rain." She wasn't sure if she meant the horse or the world. And inside that horse, Farias did something unexpected. He began to hum. Soft. Barely there. Just a thread of voice wrapped around the lyre's notes. It wasn't lyrics. Just vowel sounds. Like the way the sea sings to itself in waves. His companions didn't stop him. Even Odysseus, who had once thrown a helmet at a snoring soldier, simply listened. And in that moment, inside a weapon meant for deception, something deeply human happened. They felt safe. Not from battle. Not from fate. But from forgetting who they were before all this started. The boy who raced his brother through fig orchards. The girl who taught him how to braid garlic for winter. The old man who carved patterns into olive pits for luck. Music, dull and strange and beautiful, pulled those memories up like sun-warmed roots from deep earth. Now, let your own memories wander. Remember a sound that once made you feel held. Maybe the hum of a ceiling fan, the creak of a swing, the lull of a train rocking its rails beneath a gray sky. Let that feeling settle in your bones. Because tonight, in this story, the music is not a performance. It's a bridge between war and peace, between silence and song, between sleep and the first quiet moment in a very long time. Back in the palace, King Priam stirred in his bed. He dreamt of horses, of lyres, of fields filled with tall grass and no roads at all. He didn't know what the morning would bring. None of them did. But for a few hours more, Troy slept. And inside the belly of a hollowed-out horse, warriors dreamed too. The last hour before dawn always feels like it belongs to no one. It's too late to stay up, too early to rise. A strange little space in the world's rhythm, like a forgotten pause in a lullaby. And in that space, the city of Troy held its breath. The rain had stopped. The streets were slick, glistening like old bronze polished under torchlight. Somewhere, a rooster crowed too early, was told off by a passing raven, and promptly went back to bed. The wooden horse stood still. Inside, the warriors were, unbelievably, sleeping. Or at least pretending to. You can only whisper for so long before you realize everyone's heard your best stories twice, and your worst ones 3 times. Farias had tucked his lyre beneath his cloak. Not to hide it, just to let it rest. The strings were quiet now, but their echoes seemed to linger in the wood. And outside, in a tavern still faintly warm from last night's fire, the innkeeper's daughter, Thalia, swept the floor with half-closed eyes. She hummed to herself, a simple tune, the same one her father sang while kneading dough, the same one her mother sang before the war. She paused, tilted her head. "I hear it again," she whispered. Her dog, unimpressed, snored softly from under the counter. Back at the palace, Urale was finally asleep, curled in a chair, clutching a blanket that smelled like old cedar. In her dreams, the horse played songs only she could understand, songs made from wind and ink and the sound of sandals on marble. And while she slept, the sky began to shift. A strip of silver peeled slowly across the horizon, the kind of silver that whispers, something is coming, but doesn't say what. Inside the horse, Odysseus opened one eye. It was time. He didn't say it out loud. He didn't need to. The others stirred as if they had felt it too, some ancient clock ticking down inside their ribs. But before action, there was a moment. A still, shared breath. No war cries. No wild eyes. Just a group of men who had survived 10 years of madness, sitting in the dark, listening to the ghost of a song echo inside a wooden animal. Farias reached for his lyre one last time. Not to play a battle hymn, not to distract the Trojans, but to remember what it felt like to be human before swords and ships and siege towers. One note, then 2. Simple, like rain, like olives in brine, like the hush between thunder and applause. Then he stopped. Outside, Troy stirred. Guards yawned. Fire pits crackled. Birds began their usual arguments. And at long last, the belly of the beast opened. What happened next? Well, you already know, don't you? War, chaos, fire. But that's not where our story ends tonight. Our story ends just before all that. With the quiet, with the music, with the odd, tender truth that inside one of the greatest tricks in mythological history, someone brought a lyre and played it, not for glory, but for sleep. So now, as your eyes grow heavier and your breath slows, imagine yourself inside that horse, not as a warrior, but as a dreamer, listening to ancient strings plucked softly in the dark. Let that sound guide you deeper into calm. And remember, even in the strangest stories, even in the dullest moments of history, there is music. And sometimes that's enough. Now, shall we continue on? Chapter 2. The Fig Tart That Started a War. Let me tell you something strange. Not strange like a three-headed dog guarding the underworld. Not even strange like a talking sphinx with boundary issues. No, this is a quieter, more boring kind of strange. It's the kind that involves figs and tarts. And how? According to a story you've likely never heard, because most people fall asleep before the end, a pastry may have helped ignite the Trojan War. Yes, really. But before we get to the pastry, let's set the mood. Dim your lights. Take a deep breath. Imagine you're standing on a hillside in ancient Greece, somewhere near Sparta. The ground is dry but forgiving. The cicadas are performing their usual summer concert, each one louder than the last, like they're competing in a tiny, invisible orchestra. In the distance, the palace of King Menelaus sits like an old marble loaf, rising gently against the sky. And inside that palace, in the sun-drenched courtyard, sits Helen. Yes, that Helen. The famously beautiful, supposedly face that launched 1,000 ships Helen. But right now, she's not launching anything. She's just eating a fig tart. Not daintily, not dramatically, just eating. The way you might at home, late at night, over the sink, wearing yesterday's tunic and wondering if figs are technically a fruit or an accident. This tart, however, was no ordinary dessert. It had been made by the palace baker, whose name was Orexes, and who took himself far too seriously. He claimed his tart crust recipe came from Apollo himself, gifted to me in a dream, he'd say, while furiously dusting everything with honeyed sesame seeds. The filling was mashed figs, spiced wine, and crushed walnuts. There was something vaguely lemony in there too, even though no one quite knew what lemons were yet. Orexes just called it citrus surprise and winked dramatically. And on this particular afternoon, Helen was on her second tart. Across the courtyard, a visitor had just arrived, young, smug, and with hair so perfectly curled it looked like he'd been styled by Poseidon's personal wave set. His name? Paris. Yes, that Paris. But again, not a moment of action. Not yet. He was standing awkwardly near the fountain, pretending not to notice Helen, and failing. His hands were behind his back, probably hiding a very mediocre gift. Helen, chewing, glanced up. Their eyes met. Then she sneezed. Not delicately. Not like a noblewoman embroidered into a vase. It was the kind of sneeze that startles cats. Paris flinched. Helen sniffed and waved a hand dismissively. Pollen, she said. Or figs. Or my husband's cologne. Paris, brilliant conversationalist that he was, nodded solemnly and said, Ah. Pause. Then he added, That tart looks excellent. Helen raised an eyebrow. It's above average. And that, oddly enough, was the beginning of it all. You see, in the great epic poems, they like to skip this stuff. They leap straight into the stealing, the sailing, the whole kidnapping the queen debacle. But in quieter tales, buried in lesser-known scrolls and offhand whispers from old Greek kitchen gossips, they say it all started here, with a fig tart. And not even a fresh one, mind you. It had been sitting in the sun. The crust was starting to sweat. Still, there was something about that moment. The awkwardness, the sweet stickiness of figs, the sound of sandals scuffing on worn marble, that made it oddly real. Paris, unsure of what to say next, pointed to the tray beside Helen. May I? She shrugged. Depends. Can you be trusted with tart privileges? He grinned. I've passed several trials of the gods. She narrowed her eyes. That sounds made up. It is, he said, biting into a tart. But this is worth it. And there, for a moment, it was quiet again. In the corner, a pigeon flapped off in search of breadcrumbs. A servant tripped over a jug of grape must. Someone sneezed in solidarity. But mostly, it was just two people, one of whom would soon cause an entire civilization to fall, sharing a fig tart. Now, I know what you're thinking. Surely the war was caused by honor, politics, divine interference. And yes, technically, but let's not underestimate the power of dessert. Helen later claimed she had no idea what Paris was planning, that he never said anything about ships or Trojan walls, just compliments and tarts and something about the music of your laughter, which, to be honest, sounds like something written on a scroll found inside a scented candle. But in this slow, sleepy version of the story, they were just two mildly bored people in an over-decorated palace, slowly drifting toward history. So now, let yourself drift, too. Imagine that fig tart. Sweet, dense, a little chewy. The walnuts crunch faintly. The spice of the wine gives it warmth, like the memory of a campfire you didn't know you missed. Let that taste linger, and let your breath slow to match the quiet rhythm of that courtyard. Because before the war, before the ships, before the horse, there was just a tart, and a pause, and a sneeze. By the time the sun began to slope toward the horizon, casting sleepy shadows across the olive trees, Paris had eaten 3 tarts, insulted one servant by calling grape must confusingly purple, and successfully introduced himself to Helen's favorite cat, Melon. Melon was, as cats often are in stories like this, unimpressed. He sat perched on a stone pedestal, judging Paris with narrowed yellow eyes, tail flicking with ancient disdain. In Greek lore, cats weren't given much mythology. They were neither sacred nor heroic. But Melon was the sort of cat who made you wonder why. Paris, gently brushing fig seeds from his tunic, tried his best to act charming. He was good at that. He had been told, more than once, that his smile could win over kings and gods alike. But Helen wasn't a god. She was tired of expectations, of poetry, of always having to be the most beautiful woman in the world, as if that were a job description with quarterly reviews. So when Paris made yet another comment about how the sunlight turned her hair into a river of honey, she said dryly, "That's lovely. Tell it to my pillow later." He blinked. Then he laughed. A warm, honest laugh. The kind that slips out before your ego catches it. And for a moment, just a small, sleepy moment, they were simply people again. Not pieces on a divine chessboard. Not causes of conflict. Just a man and a woman sitting near a courtyard fountain, full of tarts and not yet full of consequences. Meanwhile, inside the palace kitchen, Orex's the baker was livid. "I gave them 6 tarts," he said, hands floured and flapping. 6. And not a single compliment on the sesame crust. One of the kitchen girls patted his shoulder. Maybe they were distracted. Maybe by love. Orex's snorted. Love doesn't excuse ignoring caramelized edges. He stomped off toward the pantry to mutter at his olive oil collection. He named each amphora. The favorite was called Athena's Drizzle. Back in the courtyard, Paris had decided to try flattery again, this time by comparing Helen's eyes to the sea near Tenedos. Helen replied, "That's the sea where the fishermen always smell like squid." "Ah," Paris said, reconsidering. "Then, perhaps more like the sea at dawn?" "Better," she said, noncommittally. She stood, brushing pastry flakes from her tunic, and wandered toward the mosaic floor that lined the edge of the garden. It depicted Athena standing triumphantly over a defeated monster. Some say a representation of ignorance. Others say it looked suspiciously like the baker, Orex's, with a fish tail. Paris followed, cautious but curious. He watched her trace the edge of a tile with her sandal. "Why did you really come here?" she asked, not looking at him. He hesitated. "To meet you." A pause. "Truly?" she said, glancing sideways. "No," he admitted. "Also to escape some people who want me to stop writing poetry." That made her smile. "What kind of poetry?" "The kind that rhymes spear with fear and tears," he said. "Deeply original." "I see," she said. "You're dangerous." He grinned. Wildly so. Then she turned toward him fully and said something that would stick in his mind forever, even as warships burned and cities crumbled. "I don't need danger. I need something interesting." And just like that, something shifted. Not the world. Not yet. Just the air. That peculiar, expectant feeling, like when a storm is still miles away but the wind already knows. They stood there in silence, two mythic figures not yet mythic, each trying to decide whether the next sentence would be clever or catastrophic. In the trees nearby, a sleepy owl blinked its approval. Elsewhere in the palace, Menelaus, Helen's husband, was still out hunting. He had caught nothing but a mild sunburn and a deep suspicion that his favorite sandals were giving him a bunion. He would return home later, cheerful and full of stories about how a board definitely almost charged him. And when he entered the courtyard, he would find Paris gone, Helen humming, and a distinct shortage of fig tarts. But that was still hours away. For now, Helen turned back toward the fountain. "Would you like another? Another tart?" She nodded. Paris hesitated, then said, "Only if you share it." She did. And while the world beyond Sparta turned as it always had, slowly, sleepily, unknowingly, something began to take shape. Not a plan. Not yet. Just a nudge. The kind that starts with a pastry and ends in poetry, sales, and 10 years of arguing over who really started it. So now breathe gently. Imagine the taste of that tart. The subtle warmth of spiced figure. The way the crust breaks beneath your teeth. Not too crisp, not too soft. Just right. Like something baked by someone whose name is olive oil. Let that flavor sink into the quiet of your mind. Because even great wars can begin with small sweets. And some nights, the most important sound in history isn't the clash of swords, but the soft crunch of pastry between strangers. Now, let's drift past the crumbs and into the softer folds of what happened next. Helen, with her tart half-eaten and her thoughts somewhere between irritation and intrigue, had walked slowly through the palace garden. Paris followed, at a respectable distance, but not so far that she couldn't hear the mild creaking of his sandals. You know the kind of creak. That oddly polite squeak that insists, "I'm here, but not too here." Like when someone tries to open a snack quietly during a performance and fails dramatically. The garden was warm. Not hot. Just warm enough that the grape leaves curled slightly at their edges, and bees made lazy arcs between lavender blossoms like they were conducting a symphony only they understood. Helen paused at a fountain shaped like a dolphin wearing what appeared to be a laurel crown. She narrowed her eyes. "I've never liked this fountain," she said. "It looks too smug." Paris considered it. "It does," he agreed, as if it just beat everyone at chess without using its fins. They laughed, soft, like people who weren't sure they were allowed to. The kind of laugh that feels borrowed. For a moment, Helen forgot where she was, who she was, what she was supposed to represent. Instead, she felt the late afternoon sun on her neck, the faint tang of figs still on her tongue, and the weight of a glance from a man who looked at her like she wasn't already famous. Then, he said something that would, eventually, get them all into trouble. He said, "You should come with me." Not as a command. Not even really as an invitation. More like a suggestion you whisper to a bird on a windowsill and hope it listens. Helen blinked. "To Troy." Paris nodded. "Just for a visit." "Ah, yes. Just for a visit." History, of course, will tell you it wasn't that simple. That Aphrodite had promised Helen to Paris after he awarded her the golden apple in a divine beauty contest judged by a man with a sheep and no credentials. We'll get to that later. But in this moment, there were no goddesses, no ships, no curses, just a woman and a man and a shared sense that maybe, just maybe, the rest of the world had gotten too loud, and maybe a change of scenery was like a second tart. Unnecessary, indulgent, but irresistible. Helen didn't answer. Not right away. Instead, she walked to a fig tree at the edge of the garden and plucked a fruit. Not quite ripe. She rolled it between her fingers. Thoughtful. And then she asked him something odd. "Do they sing in Troy?" Paris tilted his head. "Sing? Yes. The people. The street vendors. The fishermen. Do they hum while they work?" He smiled. "Yes. Badly. But with heart." Helen smiled back. "That's good. I don't trust a city without a tune." And that, dear listener, is a phrase to remember. Meanwhile, back inside the palace, Orexes was creating a new tart, this time with dates, cinnamon, and something he referred to as ambrosial flair, which turned out to be crushed mint and a sprinkle of edible flowers. "This one," he muttered, "will launch 2,000 ships." No one was listening. Elsewhere, a minor nobleman tried to write a letter complaining about the state of the palace stables, but got distracted halfway through by a nearby lute player who kept singing songs about lost sandals. Life in Sparta was, at that moment, perfectly ordinary, which is how history often likes to sneak up on you. Not during drama, but in the calm before it. When people are full and drowsy and convinced that everything will stay exactly the same. Later that evening, Paris prepared to leave. Not forever. Not yet. But he sensed the tide turning. He could feel the weight of decisions lining up behind him like dominoes leaning toward the edge of the table. He turned back to Helen. Will you think about it? I'll do more than that, she said. I'll dream about it. He bowed. Slightly. Because he was dramatic like that. Then he stepped through the archway and was gone. Helen remained at the fountain, eyes on the smug dolphin, now splashing softly in the dusk. She murmured, I still don't like you. The dolphin, smugly, kept spraying. That night, she dreamed of ships. But not of war. Of sails flapping like lazy wings. Of strange music echoing down marble halls. Of fig trees growing on rooftops. And of voices, some singing, some weeping, all tangled in melodies that felt just beyond reach. Let your own mind drift with her now. Let it sway like a boat on quiet waves, not rushing anywhere, just bobbing gently through the waters of what might be. Taste the figs again. Feel the air of that garden. Hear the distant hum of someone plucking a lyre in another city far away, unaware that the future is already sailing toward them in soft ripples. And know this, sometimes the most dangerous thing in the world is not a sword or a storm. It's an idea, wrapped in sweetness, whispered over pastry. Dawn arrived in Sparta like a quiet house guest, soft-footed, gentle, and entirely too early. The olive trees dripped with dew. A rooster tried to crow, missed his mark, and gave up halfway through. Somewhere in the market, a fishmonger was arguing with himself about whether today was a trout day or a sardine day. And in the palace? Helen awoke to the smell of fresh bread and something unmistakably minty. She groaned. Orexes is experimenting again. Down in the kitchen, the baker had, in fact, created what he called the diplomatic tart. It had layers, figs for sweetness, dates for texture, mint for surprise, and a sprinkle of sea salt to represent the tears of kingdoms, as he claimed, while wearing a new apron that said bake like a hero. His assistant, a young lad named Petros who would rather be sculpting goat figurines out of marble, simply nodded and went back to buttering the pans. Elsewhere in the palace, Menelaus was awake. Barefoot, shirt half-tucked, reading a pigeon-delivered message upside down, and trying to figure out if he'd promised to host a feast for visiting envoys or just agreed to lend them his best ladle. He had not yet noticed Helen's mood had changed. She moved through the palace with the kind of slow grace that can only be described as wistful with a hint of tart regret. At breakfast, he talked about hunting. She nodded politely. He offered her goat cheese with honey. She said, "Thank you," and thought about Trojans. He remarked on the weather. She imagined the sea. That's how it begins, doesn't it? That quiet drifting. You're sitting in your life, drinking warm goat's milk, smiling when expected, and inside, a small ship has already launched and is sailing gently, invisibly, toward elsewhere. Later that day, while no one was paying attention, because the palace dog had gotten stuck in a wine jug again, Paris returned. Not with an army, not with gifts, but with music. A lyre, to be precise. Slightly out of tune. The strings looked like they had been rest-strung using old sandal straps. But he played it anyway, sitting casually beneath Helen's balcony like some mythological busker. The song wasn't good. In fact, it was arguably one of the more confusing ballads ever composed, with references to clouds, clams, and the fire inside your olives. But still she listened. Because someone singing badly for you on purpose is more intimate than silence shared out of habit. When he finished, he stood and bowed. Not dramatically, not performatively, just enough. She leaned on the balcony and called down. "You'll need to work on your metaphors." "I'm trying," he said. "My last audience was a goat who didn't applaud." She smiled. That evening, they met again. This time, not in the courtyard. They walked by the stables. The smell of hay and lazy horses hung thick in the air. A fly buzzed past like a nosy spy. And in the background, the faint sound of someone, likely Orexes, arguing with a bag of flour about expectations. Paris reached for her hand, but stopped short. "I don't want to steal you," he said quietly. "I just want you to know you can leave." She didn't respond right away. Because it's one thing to be stolen, and another to walk out the door on your own. Eventually, she whispered, "I like that you asked." Later that night, as the palace slept and the fig tree swayed gently in a breeze that had nowhere in particular to go, Helen packed lightly. Not out of necessity, but because, in truth, She didn't need much. A brush, a shawl, a small carved charm from her sister, and one tart, wrapped in a napkin, still warm. Orexes would later declare it was the greatest compliment his baking ever received. He would go on to open a small dessert stall on the Athenian coast, branding it Tarts of Troy, where he sold pastries to philosophers who argued loudly about flavor pairings. But that's another story. This moment is quieter. Just Helen, stepping into the night, guided not by fate or flames, but by the dull sweetness of something new. In the harbor, Paris waited. No ship with sails of gold. No dramatic music. Just a simple boat. A borrowed oar. And two hearts, unsure of everything except that fig tarts should not be wasted. So now, picture that boat rocking gently on calm water. The stars above, blinking slowly like tired watchmen. The moon, fat and soft, dipping its reflection into the sea. And the tart, half eaten between them, crumbs scattering like strange little seeds of legend. Let yourself drift with them now, not toward war, not toward gods, but toward the sound of water slapping gently against the hull, and the quiet thrill of not knowing what comes next. The boat sliced through the Aegean like a spoon through soft cheese. Not quickly, not elegantly, just persistently. Helen sat near the prow, her shawl drawn tight, the early morning wind tugging gently at her sleeves like a curious child. The water around them whispered its usual sleepy lullaby, lapping the boat in soft syllables. Hush, hush, hush. Paris rowed with the confidence of a man who'd never really rowed before, but had once watched someone else do it and thought, how hard can it be? It turned out quite hard, but Helen didn't comment. She watched the way his hair kept falling into his eyes, the way he occasionally glanced at her and quickly looked away, as if unsure whether this was really happening or just the world's longest fig dream. Between them, the tart, what remained of it, rested on a folded cloth. She reached over, broke off a piece of crust, and chewed slowly. It's better cold, she admitted. Less showy, more honest. Paris smiled. Like most things. The island of Cythera came into view just as the sun lifted itself out of the sea, yawning golden light across the waves. Birds shrieked in celebration, although mostly at each other. Helen sighed. That's the island of Aphrodite, isn't it? He nodded. Where she's said to have first stepped from the sea foam. Helen looked down at her fig-sticky fingers. Do you think she'd approve of all this? Paris shrugged. Gods are fickle, but she might like the story. Now let's pause here. Because this moment, this very quiet, mildly seasick, fig-flavored moment, is the calm at the very center of a mythic storm. It's the eye of the tale, before ships are summoned, before heroes get dramatic, before gods start hurling curses like decorative fruit baskets. And it's here that Helen, gazing out at the pink-rimmed sky, spoke a thought that had lived quietly in her for years. I wasn't made for marble. Paris looked over. What do you mean? She turned, eyes soft. Everyone sees me like a statue. Carved. Perfect. Frozen in a story I didn't write. But I'm not stone. I'm skin. I sneeze. I drool when I nap. I burn tarts. Paris chuckled. You've got crumbs on your chin. She wiped them away without shame. Exactly. And that, truly, was what made her dangerous. Not her beauty, not her lineage, but the fact that she wanted to live, to feel things, to be more than a line in someone else's epic. That night, when they landed on the shores of Troy, the city was quiet. A breeze carried the scent of roasted leeks and sea salt. Somewhere, a dog barked once, then thought better of it. Paris helped Helen from the boat, not because she needed it, but because he liked the excuse. They stepped onto the sand together, two people wrapped in the kind of silence that feels like a beginning and an ending all at once. The guards, surprised but not particularly ambitious, blinked at the sight of them and offered some lukewarm wine. Helen accepted, drank, and said, "That tastes like it was angry in a past life." They laughed. The guards didn't. A servant scurried off to alert King Priam, who would be more confused than angry, and then ultimately delighted to have something new to discuss at dinner. And Helen? She was given a room overlooking the sea. She unpacked her things slowly, shawl, charm, brush, and a single fig seed, saved from the tart. She placed it on the windowsill, just in case. The next few days passed in a kind of golden haze. Troy, for all its impending doom, was rather lovely that week. Musicians played too loudly in the square. The bakers sold sesame rolls shaped like helmets. Children played at sword fighting using fennel stalks. And Helen, walking the gardens of a palace that was not hers, felt, if not free, then at least unpolished. Which, for her, was bliss. Paris showed her the city's quirks. The crooked stairs in the East Tower, the statue that looked like it was mid-sneeze, the market vendor who insisted his goats could predict the weather. "Rain," said one such goat, standing under a clear sky. Helen smiled. He's ambitious. But even in the quiet, something stirred beneath it all. Whispers, murmurs, the edges of unease. And far away, in Sparta, Menelaus woke to an empty bed and the faint scent of figs. He stood in silence for a long time. Then he whispered, "Oryxes is going to be furious." Eventually, of course, ships were called. Spears were lifted. War songs were sung off-key. But for now, for this last stretch of calm, there was just the hum of city life, the rustle of fig leaves in the breeze, and a woman sitting on a balcony, watching the seed she'd planted begin to sprout. Small, green, quiet, just like beginnings often are. So breathe deeply now. Let the scent of that mythic tart wrap around your dreams. Taste the warmth of the past. Feel the hush before the storm. And remember, not all legends begin with lightning. Some start with laughter. And pastry. Chapter 3. The Lute Maker's Lament. Good evening again, dear friend. Settle back under your blanket. Let your shoulders relax. Let your eyes go soft around the edges. Because tonight, we wander into the sleepy corners of ancient Athens, far from the battlefields, far from royalty and rebellion. Tonight's story belongs to a man who was neither hero nor villain. He didn't steal queens. He didn't build wooden horses. He made lutes. And he worried a lot. His name was Theaster, and he lived on the edge of the agora, the Athenian marketplace, where philosophers shouted and chickens wandered freely, both equally confident they were important. Theaster's workshop smelled of cedar dust and warm beeswax. Every morning, just before dawn, he would shuffle in with a cup of watered wine, sit on his favorite stool, the one that wobbled only slightly, and begin the day's task: carving, sanding, tuning. Not for fame, not even for money, really. He just liked the way it would whispered under his knife, like it had secrets to tell, if he listened closely. His neighbors called him Theaster the String Whisperer. He hated it. "I don't whisper to strings," he'd mutter. "I argue with them. They're stubborn." But secretly, he was proud, because he knew something that others didn't. The soul of music didn't come from gods or golden instruments. It came from getting your fingers full of splinters, making mistakes, and learning exactly how many sheep gut strands it took to make a note sound less like a dying goose. On this particular morning, Theaster was hunched over a half-finished lute. The shape was lovely, rounded like a teardrop or a very thoughtful melon. But something wasn't right. The tone was off. Not bad exactly, just too cheerful. He plucked the strings and winced. "Sounds like a songbird fell in love with a tambourine," he muttered. His apprentice, a teen named Lysandros with too many opinions and not enough socks, wandered in chewing a barley cake. "You could lean into it," Lysandros suggested. "Make it a happy lute." "I don't do happy lutes," Theaster replied. "They don't sell." This was mostly true. Sad instruments were popular that season. Ever since rumors of a brewing war reached Athens, people wanted melancholy music. Music that said, "Yes, everything's fine, but also maybe we're doomed." Theaster plucked again. Still too chipper. He sighed. "It needs more ache." Lysandros blinked. "Like physical pain?" "No, no," Theaster said, waving his chisel. "Emotional ache. The kind you get from unfinished conversations and figs that weren't ripe when you bit into them." He put the lute down and stared at it like it had betrayed him. Sometimes he wondered why he cared so much. After all, he wasn't a musician. He could barely hum in tune. But when he made instruments, when he shaped the wood just right, he could feel something humming back. Not music. Not exactly. More like memory. Each lute, each lyre, each kithara he made held on to something. A breeze from the day he carved it. A laugh that echoed through the shop when someone told a bad joke. The faint stain of olive oil from lunch. And this lute, this odd, cheerful, annoying lute, refused to be anything other than what it was. Bright. Lysandros, finishing his barley cake, asked the question that had been bubbling in his head all week. Master, do you think music can stop a war? The Uster blinked. What? You know? Like, instead of fighting. Just play a concert. The Uster squinted. Depends. Are we talking flute or full chorus? Maybe drums. Definitely not drums, the Uster said. Drums start wars. Too loud. Too rhythmic. Liars. Now liars can cause confusion. People stop to listen. Forget what they were yelling about. He paused. But if you really want peace, give everyone a badly tuned lute. They'll be too busy fixing it to fight. They both laughed. Outside, the city yawned into motion. Merchants shouted. Chickens strutted. A goat tried to eat someone's toga. But inside the workshop, time moved differently. The Uster picked up the lute again and adjusted the bridge. Plucked. Listened. Still bright. But now with something else beneath it, a note of longing. A gentle ache. He smiled, just a little. Better, he said. And across the sea, in a city called Troy, someone sat on a balcony, plucking a very different instrument. Helen, still adjusting to her new surroundings, had requested a lyre. The palace servants gave her a beautiful one, ivory inlaid with gold. But she hated it. Too perfect, she muttered. So she asked for a different one, a simpler one. And eventually, they brought her a lute, made in Athens, they said, signed faintly on the back with the mark of a small owl and a crooked olive branch. She plucked a string. It sounded like the beginning of something. And far away, the Uster felt the breeze shift. Now, let yourself feel it, too. The soft grain of wood underhand. The scent of sawdust and wine. The slow, careful making of something that might one day carry someone else's memories across oceans. Because sometimes, the oddest connections span cities, wars, and centuries. And sometimes, all it takes is one stubborn lute. The next day, the Uster was visited by a philosopher. This was not unusual. In Athens, philosophers popped up like dandelions, uninvited, persistent, and frequently covered in chalk dust. This one wore a robe that had clearly been slept in, eyes like thunderclouds, and a beard that seemed to be growing in 5 different directions. The Uster, he boomed, as though greeting a large crowd rather than one lute maker and a mildly terrified apprentice. Philomedes, the Uster said, not looking up. If you're here to ask whether sound exists without ears again, the answer is still I don't care. Philomedes grinned. No. Today I bring a commission. That made the Uster look up. Philosophers rarely paid for anything. They preferred bartering ideas, which translated roughly to talking at you for 3 hours and forgetting their purse. Philomedes produced a scroll from his sleeve and slapped it on the workbench, scattering wood curls like sleepy butterflies. I've written a treatise, he announced, on the emotional correspondence between musical modes and various goat behaviors. Lysandros groaned audibly in the background. And, Philomedes continued, unfazed, I wish to present it with a live demonstration. The Uster squinted. You want me to build an instrument for goats? Not for goats, the philosopher corrected. Inspired by goats. There was a long silence. Somewhere, a cricket chirped. Dramatically, the Uster finally said, What exactly are you envisioning? Philomedes beamed. A double-necked lyre with alternating tuning pegs, some for harmony, some for chaos. Strings made of varied tension. The sound should be unpredictable, like a goat on a cliffside mid-storm. The Uster blinked. So cursed. Precisely, Philomedes said. But musical. The commission was, strangely, tempting. Not because it made sense, but because it was exactly the kind of absurdity the Uster needed to shake the strange melancholy from his shop. He accepted, and for the next several days, the workshop was filled with the most bizarre sounds ever to echo through the agora. Plucks, bleats, twangs, and the occasional loud boing that startled birds into flight. Meanwhile, Lysandros had questions. Master, he asked on the second day, why do you keep sighing every time you touch the cheerful lute? The Uster glanced at the now finished, still too joyful instrument sitting in the corner. Because it doesn't need me. Lysandros frowned. That's dramatic. No, listen, the Uster said, turning toward him with glue-smudged fingers. Most instruments fight you. They want to be one thing, and you want them to be another. But that one, he pointed, that one already knows itself. I didn't shape it. It shaped itself. Lysandros considered. Sounds like someone you used to love. The Uster gave him a look. You've been spending too much time near the poets. He wasn't wrong, though, because across the sea, in Troy, Helen had fallen in love with that very lute. She played it each morning, not for crowds, not for court, just for herself. She called it Whisper because it never demanded attention, only offered it. The kind of lute that could accompany your thoughts without trying to outshine them. Paris, curious, had asked to hear it once. She played a tune that didn't have a name, something that sounded like the first rain after a drought. He said it made him want to write poetry. She said, "Don't." He agreed. Elsewhere in the palace, servants began humming fragments of her melodies without realizing it. One swore she peeled onions faster when the tune played. Another claimed their bread rose better with the music in the background. And in the temple of Apollo, the priests took note. Literally, they scribbled fragments of Helen's songs onto wax tablets, certain they were divine. They whispered that maybe she wasn't just a queen, but a vessel, that maybe the gods spoke through her strings. Helen found this hilarious. "I'm just bored," she told Paris. "Music is how I don't unravel." And Paris, who understood unraveling better than he let on, nodded. Back in Athens, Theaster was finishing the goat-inspired lyre when something unexpected happened. A traveler arrived, sunburned, sandal-tattered, and carrying a message. Not a scroll, a request. "A Trojan noble heard one of your lutes," the man said, sipping water gratefully. "He wants another, made by the same hands." Theaster blinked. "Which lute?" The traveler shrugged. He said it sounded like moonlight on olive leaves. "Whatever that means." Theaster stared at the cheerful lute in the corner. "Oh, that one." He walked over to it slowly, picked it up, and strummed a single chord. Still bright, still impossible. And yet, he smiled. "I'll make another. But this time," he whispered to the wood, "you'll have a little sorrow in you. Let your own thoughts now drift like that lute's sound across warm air. Feel the tools in hand, the soft give of cedar, the faint hum of music not yet born. Because in every war, in every love, in every story that stretches too long to stay exciting, there is always someone in the background carving something soft. And sometimes, that's the note that echoes longest." A few days later, the workshop smelled like oranges. Not because anyone had peeled one. Theaster disliked fruit that sprayed without warning, but because Lysandros had tried a new polish on the latest lute. A mixture of olive oil, beeswax, and the zest of a half-rotten orange he'd found behind the olive press. Theaster had sniffed the instrument suspiciously. "It smells like ambition and mold," he said. "Perfect for the Trojans," Lysandros replied. The cheerful lute, still sitting in the corner like an old friend who never left, seemed to judge them both in silence. Theaster sighed. "I miss building sad things." And yet, he couldn't stop looking at it. That lute had gone beyond craft. It had become a sort of presence in the shop. Not magical, not divine, just familiar. The kind of familiar you get from wearing the same tunic for years. Comfortable, slightly misshapen, impossible to throw away. Meanwhile, the courier, still hanging around the agora, was teaching goats to walk in a circle using only dried apple slices and vague encouragement. He claimed it was a form of musical meditation. Philomedes approved. The goats have rhythm. Back inside, Theaster was working on a new piece, the requested sibling to the cheerful lute. This one would be quieter, slower, not sad exactly, but deeper, more thoughtful, like the sound of someone remembering a name they haven't said in years. He carved the neck from a piece of driftwood he'd kept under the bench for over a decade. "Why now?" Lysandros asked. Theaster shrugged. "The wood finally told me it was ready." Lysandros opened his mouth to question that, then didn't. He was learning. And as the days passed, the lute took shape. Not quickly, not cleanly. There were mistakes. A splinter, a broken string, a long pause when Theaster forgot what he was doing and just stared at the sunlight shifting across the wall, watching dust dance like lazy thoughts. And across the sea, in Troy, Helen was doing the same. The cheerful lute, Whisper, rested on her lap. She plucked it idly while looking out at the sea. The tune she played was new, and yet it wasn't. It had crept into her fingers like something remembered, not learned. It was the kind of tune that could make a baker pause mid-stir, that could stop a conversation in its tracks without anyone realizing why. Paris watched from a distance. He loved her most when she wasn't trying, when she wasn't being Helen, the idea, the myth. He loved her when she scratched her ankle with her foot while still playing. When she frowned at a wrong note like it had personally offended her family. And when she smiled, softly, as if a secret had just landed on her shoulder. One afternoon, while she played, an old Trojan woman passing through the garden stopped. "That song," she said. "My mother used to sing it when I was small, but it didn't have a name." Helen looked up. "I thought I made it up." The woman smiled. "Perhaps it made itself up through you." That evening, Helen wrote the tune down, not with words, but with little marks and swirls on parchment. Her own notation system, meaningless to others, perfect to her. She folded the parchment and placed it inside the lute, beneath the strings, like a lullaby tucked into a pillow. Back in Athens, Theaster tied the final knot on his new lute strings. It looked similar to the cheerful one, same shape, same polish. But the wood was darker, the bridge slightly lower, the sound hole carved with a single tiny swirl, like the curl of a sleeping child's ear. He plucked. A deep tone emerged. Not sad, not happy, just steady. He played again. Another note. This one sounded like a question you forgot to ask. Lysandros listened, eyes wide. "That's," he began. "Enough," Theaster finished. They wrapped the lute in linen. Not silk, not wool, just plain linen, soft and clean and not trying to impress anyone. The courier, now somewhat famous for his goat ensemble, accepted the instrument without ceremony. "I'll deliver it to the palace," he promised. "Which one?" Theaster asked. The courier winked. "The one that hasn't burned yet." Lysandros raised an eyebrow. Comforting. As the courier disappeared into the crowd, the shop fell quiet. Theaster sat, wiped his hands on his apron, looked at the cheerful lute. Then, slowly, he picked it up. He played one note, and smiled, not because it was perfect, but because it reminded him of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. And far away, in a city preparing for everything and expecting nothing. Helen waited. "Now breathe in. Let the scent of orange polish and cedar fill your senses. Let the sound of string and silence blend into something deeper. Let your mind rest in the workshop's hush, where music begins not in performance, but in care. Because sometimes the softest things are what echo longest through time." A week later, the lute arrived. Not in a grand procession, not with trumpets or silk-draped carts. Just a courier, dusty from travel, with an awkward gait and a bag full of goat treats. Helen was in the garden when they brought it to her. Early morning, when the shadows were still long and the dew hadn't yet made up its mind about disappearing. She reached for the linen-wrapped bundle without hesitation. Whisper, her cheerful lute, rested beside her on a stone bench, basking in the sun like a sleepy pet. Unwrapping the new lute was like opening a letter from a version of herself she hadn't met yet. It was heavier than Whisper. Slightly, just enough to notice. The finish was matte, the color deep, almost like the inside of a pomegranate left too long on a windowsill. She plucked one string, and paused. The note wasn't pretty. It was honest. A little uneven. A little raw. The kind of sound that follows a long exhale when you've been pretending all day. She plucked again. A second note joined the first. Then a third. Slowly, something unfolded between her hands. Not a song. Not yet. But a memory waiting to find its rhythm. Paris, watching from the colonnade, tilted his head. "That's not the usual one," he said. Helen nodded. "It's a sibling." Paris stepped closer. "Same maker?" "Yes," she whispered. "But this one understands something different." She didn't explain further. Some instruments, like some thoughts, only make sense when you play them at just the right time. Usually when you're sad, or in love, or somewhere between both. She played for hours that day. Nothing repeatable. Nothing anyone could follow. But the garden listened. The flowers tilted. The air grew warmer, as if leaning in. That evening, she played again, this time to the moon. Not because she believed it was watching, but because it always had been. And far away, in Athens, Theaster sat beside the workshop window, gazing at the same moon, holding the cheerful lute in his lap. He didn't play it. Not yet. He just held it, like an old friend who didn't need words. Lysandros entered carrying a tray, wine, figs, cheese that had definitely turned, and something vaguely resembling a pickle. "Dinner," he announced. Theaster sniffed the tray. "Suspicious." "Historic," Lysandros corrected. They sat in silence. Then Theaster said, almost too quietly, "She's playing it." Lysandros blinked. You mean? The lute. The one I sent. I don't know how I know. But I know. Lysandros smiled. That's either deeply poetic or slightly concerning. The Ister looked out at the stars. Maybe both. That night, the Ister dreamed of strings, not tangled or broken, but suspended gently in the air, glowing like fireflies. And when he reached out, they hummed not with music, but with memory. And back in Troy, Helen sat by the window, writing. Not poetry, not even music, just words, thoughts, what the notes reminded her of. Her mother's voice, the sound of figs being crushed for paste, the time she dropped an amphora and blamed it on a bird. Each memory, a small offering tucked into the margins of the page. She folded the paper and slid it gently into the sound hole of the new lute, joining the secret note already resting there in whisper, its sibling. Twin instruments, twin messages, two echoes traveling in opposite directions. The next morning, the court musician asked to borrow one of her lutes. She handed him Whisper, the cheerful one. Too bright, he muttered, plucking a string. It needs more drama. Helen smiled. That's why it's mine. And the new lute? She never let it leave her side. It sat beside her during meals, during meetings, even during naps. Some people carried daggers. She carried sound. And in that, she was untouchable. So now, let your own thoughts strum gently across the quiet. Picture the shape of that lute in your hands. Feel the grain beneath your fingertips. Hear the breath between notes. Because music, real music, often begins not in sound, but in silence. And sometimes, the silence holds more truth than 1,000 words ever could. The next time the Ister picked up the cheerful lute, it hummed differently. Not in sound exactly. The notes were the same, bright, plucky, a little too eager, like a puppy waiting for a command. But in feel, it no longer resisted him. It no longer insisted on being anything other than what it was. He sat in the quiet of his workshop, just after dusk, when the world softens. The street outside had emptied. The sky was that perfect shade of purple that seems to exist only for about 7 minutes each evening before giving up and turning black. He played. Not a tune, not a song, just sounds, like skipping stones across a still lake and listening to the ripples talk back. And in that moment, the Ister didn't care if anyone heard, didn't care if it sold, didn't care if someone more talented would play it later. It was enough to know the sound was there. It was enough to know someone, somewhere, maybe Helen, maybe someone he'd never meet, was playing something he'd built, and that the music stitched across the air might land in someone's chest and stay there, quietly, for years. Meanwhile, in Troy, Helen had begun teaching one of the younger palace girls how to hold the second lute. She didn't teach notes. She didn't care for technique. She taught listening. Hold it like you'd hold a secret, she said. The girl, 8 years old, too clever for her own good, said, What kind of secret? The kind you didn't know was yours until you said it out loud, Helen replied. The girl frowned thoughtfully, then strummed a string. It buzzed. Not beautiful, but real. The next day, the girl showed Helen a poem she'd written to match the notes. It was terrible, glorious, full of goats and sunsets and one dramatic line about how figs were the souls of fallen stars. Helen framed it. She hung it in her room. Because beauty isn't about polish. It's about honesty. And honest things, like laughter, like mistakes, like a lute that doesn't quite know what it's doing, have a way of living longer in memory than any perfectly carved statue. Far away, a traveler arrived in Athens. He came with news. Helen was in Troy. Menelaus was angry. Ships were being prepared. Poets were sharpening their pens and polishing their metaphors. Lysandros heard the news first. Does that mean war? He asked. The Ister paused, then nodded. It means noise. Should we do anything? The Ister looked down at his lutes. We'll make quiet. And so he did. In the days that followed, he built 3 more instruments. Each one carved a little more carefully, strung a little more loosely, tuned not for performance, but for presence. He sold none of them. Instead, he placed one in the temple, one in the market square, and one just outside the city gates, on a bench beneath an old fig tree. Each one came with a sign, play if you need to remember, leave if you already have. And slowly, people began to play. Not well, not even frequently, but enough. Enough to keep something alive in the city. Something soft, something human. And so now, dear listener, Let your thoughts drift like a lute string plucked by the gentlest hand. Let the sound stretch across time, not to impress, not to dazzle, but to soothe. Because wars are loud. But peace? Peace is made of whispering wood, buzzing strings, and the echo of one quiet man who decided to carve a different kind of memory into the world. Close your eyes, feel the music settle, and let the silence take you. Chapter 4. The Cheese That Fooled a Cyclops. Let me tell you a tale that smells a little odd. You might think it begins in a cave, with a monster, a clever man, a daring escape, but really, it begins with cheese. Warm, soft, slightly suspicious cheese. Now, before you wrinkle your nose or drift off entirely, hear me out. Because this cheese was not just any cheese. It was made from the milk of a mythical goat said to have nursed the infant Zeus himself. That's right, Olympian dairy. The story goes that this cheese had magical properties, long shelf life, an unusually calming aroma, and a flavor described by ancient poets as surprisingly tolerable, if consumed in small amounts near a breeze. But our real story starts not with Zeus, or goats, or even gods. It begins with Odysseus. Yes, that Odysseus. Clever, bearded, perpetually tired. The man who thought hiding in a wooden horse was a good idea. Who took the long way home, very long. So long, in fact, that even his daydreams needed maps. At this point in the timeline, Odysseus and his crew were just trying to get home from Troy. You know how it is. 10 years of war. You miss your bed, and suddenly you're navigating islands where sheep talk and the sea tries to eat you. On one such detour, they landed on an island that smelled faintly of thyme, ash, and, yes, cheese. The sailors sniffed the air. "Do you smell that?" one asked. "Victory," said another. "Feet," said a third. "No," Odysseus said, his eyes narrowing. "That's Cyclops cheese." Now, most of the crew hadn't heard of Cyclops cheese before, but Odysseus had. He'd read about it once on the back of a papyrus snack wrapper. Try new creamy cyclopean curd, made in mysterious caves, stomped by giant feet. And he, being curious and mildly hungry, decided they should investigate. So they walked inland, over hills, through thickets, past goats with bad attitudes, and one particularly large snail. Eventually, they found a cave. It was large, looming, and from inside came the unmistakable smell of something fermented, aged, and vaguely divine. They entered. Inside were baskets, dozens, all filled with round, lumpy wheels of what could only be described as ambitiously textured cheese. Some glowed faintly, some vibrated. One appeared to hum in a minor key. "Should we take some?" asked Eurylochus, already holding 3 wheels. Odysseus hesitated. "We should leave a note," he said. "It's only polite." So he scratched something on a shard of pottery, borrowing some cheese. "We'll return with thanks or apology." And they sat down and ate. The cheese was bizarre. Warm, chewy, a bit like eating a cloud that had feelings. It coated the tongue. It whispered things like oregano and childhood confusion. One sailor claimed to have seen his grandmother's ghost after his second bite, but they kept eating. And that's when the Cyclops came home. Now, you likely know the basics. The giant, single-eyed shepherd, Polyphemus. Big, cranky, not a fan of uninvited dairy theft. He entered the cave humming something that might have been a lullaby or might have been a threat. Stopped, sniffed, then growled, "Who touched my cheese?" Odysseus stood, still chewing. He swallowed slowly. "We were sampling." Respectfully. Polyphemus didn't answer, just squinted his one large eye. Then, he reached down and picked up a chunk of the cheese they hadn't touched. The one they'd avoided. The one that had a slightly greenish hue and seemed to sweat. "This," he said proudly, "is my best batch." No one said anything. Odysseus, ever the diplomat, nodded. "It has presence." "You think it's good?" the Cyclops asked. There was a long pause. Odysseus could lie, but instead, he said, "It's an acquired taste. But I see the vision." Polyphemus beamed. And in that moment, right there, among the cheese baskets and the rising smell of goat sweat, Odysseus made a decision. Not to fight, not to flee, but to compliment the cheese. For hours, he waxed poetic. He described the cheese's emotional depth, its surprising boldness, its whiff of prophetic decay. And Polyphemus, touched by this unexpected appreciation, softened. Most people just scream, he said. You understand fermentation. Now, we won't get ahead of ourselves. There will be a clever escape. There will be sheep. There will be lies and yelling and curses flung at ships. But not yet. For now, let us sit inside that cave, listening to the echo of awkward compliments, the occasional burp, and the quiet thrum of cheese slowly turning into legend. And outside, the stars rise slowly. Because even myths, loud, wild, bloody myths, sometimes hinge on a well-timed compliment and an oddly sincere appreciation of dairy. Let that thought lull you now. Let the warmth of the cave and the weight of your blanket merge. Let your mind wander like Odysseus, curious, clever, always one snack away from trouble. Let me tell you something about cyclopes. They are not known for subtlety. They're loud. They stomp. They squint a lot. And they have, according to ancient scrolls and at least 3 disgruntled poets, very firm opinions about livestock, weather, and lactose. Polyphemus, in particular, was fiercely proud of his dairy operation. He kept records. Not written, of course. He couldn't read. But he had a series of notched bones that he used to track aging batches. Each notch represented a flavor profile, a mood, and, apparently, one emotionally significant goat. And so, when Odysseus began complimenting his cheese, he was entering dangerous territory. Ah yes, Polyphemus said, holding up a wheel that was oozing from one side. This one matured during the week of the thunder goat. Odysseus blinked. You can taste the electricity. Polyphemus beamed. You're a rare one, he said. Most men who break into my cave don't survive long enough to taste batch 17. Odysseus chuckled nervously. I have a delicate palate. Behind him, his crew nodded emphatically, cheeks puffed out with cautious chewing. Such bold notes. One of them mumbled, tears forming. Like regret, but creamier, whispered another. Polyphemus clapped his massive hands. The echo startled 3 sheep and knocked over a basket of salted rinds. I like you, he boomed. Which, in Cyclops terms, is a formal invitation not to be eaten immediately. You'll stay for dinner, he added. Oh, we're having dinner? Odysseus asked. Yes, cheese. Everyone sighed. And something else, Polyphemus said mysteriously. He stomped toward the back of the cave. Something clanged. A goat bleated in what could only be described as protest. Moments later, he returned with a giant clay pot filled with something. The smell reached them first. Is that wine? Asked Eurylochus, gagging slightly. Polyphemus grinned. Fermented beet wine. Aged in an old helmet. Best in the region. Odysseus took a polite sip. He instantly saw visions of his third-grade philosophy tutor screaming about metaphysics. Strong, he managed. Pairs well with cheese, Polyphemus said, pouring himself a full amphora's worth. And that's when Odysseus saw his opportunity. The plan, as usual, would involve 3 things. 1, politeness. 2, flattery. 3, unchecked improvisation. As the Cyclops chugged the beet wine like it was spring water, Odysseus leaned in. Polyphemus, he said, your cheese, it's art. The Cyclops nodded solemnly. But, Odysseus continued, it could be legendary. Polyphemus blinked. Go on. Well, your cave, while rustic, is a bit remote. Imagine if your cheese traveled the world. To Athens. To Crete. To the symposiums. Polyphemus scratched his beard, which looked like a small, angry shrub. I'd need branding. Yes, Odysseus said, warming up. A name. A story. Something that makes people say, ah, yes, this tastes like being gently hit with a boulder of flavor. The Cyclops was enraptured. And I could do tastings, he shouted. Pop-up stalls. You could call it, Odysseus thought fast. Monomilk. Polyphemus burst into laughter. Because I have one eye. It's memorable, Odysseus said. The rest of the crew looked around, unsure if this was all real or a collective dairy-induced hallucination. Meanwhile, Polyphemus continued drinking. He poured more for Odysseus, who pretended to sip. More for himself. Then more. Eventually, the amphora was empty. The goat had fallen asleep in a wheel of brie, and the Cyclops was snoring so loudly the cave trembled slightly. Odysseus turned to the others. Now, he whispered, but not to escape. No, this part of the myth always gets told with swords and fire and trickery. But what they really did first? They cleaned. That's right. While Polyphemus slept, Odysseus, ever the guest, began tidying up. They swept. They reorganized the cheese. They rebalanced the goat pile. Someone even labeled a few of the more pungent wheels. Caution, mood enhancer. Because sometimes, the best trick isn't violence. It's confusion. When the Cyclops awoke, hours later, the cave sparkled. His cheeses were arranged by aroma. His favorite basket had been reinforced. Someone had even drawn a smiling sheep on the wall with soot. And Odysseus? Gone. Vanished. All that remained was a note, etched onto a clean shard of pottery. Thank you for the hospitality. Your cheese will be remembered. Nobody. Polyphemus blinked. He sniffed the air. He touched the soot drawing. And for a moment, just a moment, he smiled. The next morning, somewhere between a groggy wine headache and the realization that several of his goats had been rearranged by breed and mood, Polyphemus sat outside his cave with a chunk of his favorite cheese in one hand and a half-gnawed sheep hoof in the other. He was confused. He was used to waking up angry, hungry, slightly drooly. But this felt different. The air was clean. The cave smelled less like damp despair and more like nutty aging wheels. His goats were grazing politely. One had even been adorned with a crown made of fig leaves. He chewed his cheese slowly. The crew was long gone, of course. Odysseus and his sailors had slipped away just before sunrise, rowing quietly past the rocky shore while holding their noses and praying the wind stayed in their favor. Back on the boat, Eurylochus was fanning himself with a fish scale and groaning. I still taste beet helmet wine, he said. Count yourself lucky, muttered another. I think that one cheese aged inside a sheep. Odysseus sat at the helm, half smiling. He wasn't proud of everything he'd done in life. There had been some questionable decisions. The owl incident, the seaweed headdress, the time he'd tried to convince a king that honey was a weapon. But this ridiculous, oddly fragrant escape was one for the bards. He imagined how they'd sing of it. Brave Odysseus, hero bold, did battle not with steel or gold. He met the Cyclops, large and loud, and won with cheese. The crowd was wowed. Maybe not his best verse, but the rhythm was comforting. He looked over his shoulder at the faint outline of the island shrinking behind them. Poor Polyphemus, he murmured. The man-creature? Demi-goat. Wasn't evil, not really. Just alone. And bored. And a bit obsessed with dairy. Back on the island, the Cyclops had begun experimenting. Odysseus had planted a seed in his one-track mind. Marketing. Now Polyphemus was outside with a broken amphora, trying to shape it into a tasting tray. He had named his cheeses. Batch 17 was now Storm Whisperer. Batch 22, the runny one with a pulse, was Dionysus's misstep. He painted a welcome sign on a boulder. Polyphemus Cave Creamery, one eye on flavor. No one came, but that didn't stop him. Each day he arranged his wheels. He practiced greetings. He taught one of the goats to nod when asked. Would you recommend this cheese? And each evening, he sat with his favorite block, gnawed thoughtfully, and stared out at the sea. Now, pause with me here. Let's zoom out. This isn't a tale of battle. It isn't even really a tale of trickery. It's a tale about how, sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is acknowledge someone's passion, no matter how weird it smells. Odysseus knew this. He could have fought. He could have escaped with brute force. Instead, he complimented a cheese until its maker let his guard down. Back on the boat, the crew slowly began to recover. They argued about what the cheese actually tasted like. Hope, said one. Despair, said another. Like burnt wool and dreams, muttered a third. But all agreed on one thing. It had worked. They were free. Odysseus dipped his fingers into the sea, letting the salt water glide over his knuckles. Sometimes, he said to no one in particular, you don't need a sword. You just need a really weird compliment. From that day forward, whenever his crew encountered trouble, they had a code. Bring out the cheese, someone would say. And everyone would know. It's time to charm your way through. Meanwhile, Polyphemus began composing his own song. It wasn't very good, but it was heartfelt. Nobody came, nobody left, but nobody saw my cheese as deft. They cleaned my cave. They drew a goat. They left a note. I'll never gloat. But maybe, just maybe, I won't eat the next one who quotes poetry at me. So now, rest in that thought. That sometimes, monsters aren't monstrous. Sometimes, heroes win with kindness disguised as critique. And sometimes, cheese really is the answer. Let your mind hum like a tuning fork. Let your thoughts roll like wheels of mythic cheddar. Let your dreams smell faintly of time and possibility. A few days after their escape, Odysseus and his crew landed on a smaller, quieter island, one with sandy shores, lazy turtles, and the blessed absence of mythical cheese. They needed rest, not just for their bodies, which ached from rowing and rough sleep, but for their minds, which were still mildly vibrating with the memory of beet wine and mooing cheeses. Eurylochus stretched out on a patch of grass and sighed. If I never smell dairy again, it will be too soon. A young sailor, nibbling a stale barley biscuit, said, I think my dreams curdled. Even Odysseus, who normally found solace in new challenges, had chosen silence. He sat beneath a tree, sharpening a stick for no apparent reason, and watching a tortoise navigate around a pebble with what could only be described as heroic focus. But as is always the case in such stories, peace is rarely allowed to linger. That evening, as the crew cooked lentils over a small fire and argued about whether figs counted as dessert, they heard a faint sound in the distance. Not wind, not waves, singing, and not just any singing. Terrible singing. The kind of high-pitched warble that could make grapes wither prematurely and turn well-meaning sheep into rebellious philosophers. The men froze. Sirens, someone whispered. Odysseus listened closely. No, he said slowly. It's worse. He stood, stepping quietly toward the shoreline. And there, floating just offshore in a very large barrel-turned boat, was Polyphemus, wearing a vest made of goat fur, holding a lute that had clearly been made from a cheese wheel and a harp string, and singing at full volume. Nobody left, but nobody stayed. My cheeses are bold, my debts are all paid. I stomp with one foot, I churn with one eye. Come try my cheddar, or else you shall cry. Eurylochus groaned. He followed us. Odysseus squinted at the absurd vessel. He brought a cart of cheese? Indeed, he had. Balanced precariously in the floating barrel were 3 crates labeled Mono Milk Sample Collection. Creamy, crumbly, curious. The Cyclops waved enthusiastically. Nobody, he called. Odysseus blinked. You remembered that name? Of course. Polyphemus roared. It's the only name I trust. A long silence followed. Finally, Odysseus called back. What do you want? To enter a partnership, the Cyclops said proudly. I want to export my cheeses. Odysseus blinked. To where? Polyphemus spread his massive arms. Everywhere. Another long pause. The crew looked at Odysseus with the same face one uses when someone suggests starting a kombucha empire in the middle of a storm. He sighed. All right, he said. Let's taste one. One. And so, with the awkward ceremony of gods gone mildly mad, the Cyclops paddled to shore using a sheep as an oar, disembarked with a squeaky thud, and presented a wheel of something he called epic feta. It was dense, and wet, and somehow both sour and sweet, like someone had soaked a sugar cube in vinegar and dared the universe to care. Odysseus chewed. Slowly, he considered his words. It's assertive. Polyphemus beamed. Encouraged, he presented the next one, battle brine. This cheese cracked audibly when sliced. It smelled of old sandals and ambition. The crew backed away. Let's maybe pause there, Odysseus said, raising a hand. Polyphemus frowned. Too much. No, Odysseus said quickly. Just overwhelming. Like your voice, and presence, and footprint. Polyphemus nodded, strangely touched. You always understand me. And truly, Odysseus did. Because in Polyphemus, he saw something familiar, an overwhelming urge to be more than feared. To be remembered. And what's more human than that? So, that night, around the campfire, Odysseus invited the Cyclops to sit, to talk, to sing, to maybe not serve any more cheese. They laughed. They swapped tales. One of the sailors drew a crude map of Athens and tried to explain supply chains using pebbles and twigs. Polyphemus listened. He took notes. He even promised to stop eating visitors, at least on Mondays. Before dawn, the Cyclops stood. I must return, he said. My goats miss me. My brie needs flipping. He handed Odysseus a small wheel, delicately wrapped in fig leaves. A gift, he said, for the journey. Odysseus took it carefully. What is it? Polyphemus smiled. I call it the Nobody Special. They watched as the Cyclops climbed into his barrel, waved once, and paddled into the sea. whistling off-key and trailing a rope of seaweed and ambition. And now, let your thoughts trail behind him, slowly bobbing in the waves. Let the sound of the ocean fold over you like soft cloth. Let the absurdity of it all become strangely calming. Because even in a world of monsters and myths, sometimes all it takes to change a fate is a compliment, a song, and cheese you'll never quite forget. By the time the sun had stretched itself fully across the horizon and the last traces of Polyphemus's absurd cheese boat had disappeared into the shimmering blue, Odysseus and his crew had returned to their voyage. They were quieter now, not solemn, not sad, just digesting, both emotionally and, unfortunately, still physically. The nobody special, the gifted cheese wrapped in fig leaves, now sat at the base of the mast, casting a gentle aroma across the deck. It wasn't a bad smell exactly, just persistent, like a memory you didn't ask for but couldn't quite forget. Eurylochus had built a small windbreak out of reeds to try to contain the scent. "It's trying to communicate," he muttered. Odysseus, seated near the helm, was writing. Not a battle plan, not a poem, a recipe. He titled it, "Cyclopean Curds, Served with Caution." Ingredients included patience, boldness, possibly hallucinations, one dramatic backstory, optional fig leaves for guilt reduction beside him. One of the younger sailors stared at the sea. "Do you think he'll ever sell it?" the sailor asked. Odysseus smiled. "Sell it? Probably not. But he'll believe in it. And sometimes, belief is enough." Back on the island, Polyphemus had returned to his cave with fresh inspiration. He had new marketing slogans scrawled in goat blood on stone walls. "One eye, full flavor. Taste the legend, survive the brine. Nobody knows cheese like me." He created sample baskets, tied them to wandering goats, and sent them to neighboring isles with scrolls reading, "Try this or regret everything." No one responded. But 1 week later, a traveling bard washed ashore. Sunburned, hungry, carrying a broken flute and a cracked singing voice, he stumbled into Polyphemus's cave and collapsed. Polyphemus fed him cheese. The bard wept, not from joy, but nourishment. He stayed. He helped. He composed jingles. One became mildly famous in the port town of Thapsos. "If you've got time and iron guts and teeth like swords and friendly ruts, come try the wheel that few survive, the cheese that keeps your soul alive." It was catchy, and slowly, bizarrely, the name Mono Milk began to circulate. Not with glory, not with riches, but with a kind of respect reserved for the unexplainable. Years later, after Odysseus finally reached Ithaca and told stories to wide-eyed children, he would always pause when they asked about monsters. Which was the most dangerous? They'd whisper. He'd think of Scylla, of Charybdis, of betrayal, of loss. But then he'd smile and say, "The one who offered me cheese and asked to be seen." Because monsters, more often than not, are simply misunderstood. And behind every roar, there may be an aging wheel of dairy and a dream no one ever took seriously, until someone did. Now, rest with that. Let the sea rock gently beneath your thoughts. Let the scent of fig leaves drift slowly through your mind. Let yourself believe, just for a moment, that kindness can be carved into anything, even cheese. And somewhere, on a distant shore, a cyclops tunes his lute and sings. Chapter 5. The soup that sank a ship. Let me take you now, not to a palace, nor a cave, nor a city built of marble and myths, but to a quiet corner of the Aegean coast, to a sleepy port town with cracked tiles, crooked chimneys, and a smell in the air so rich, so oddly persuasive, that even passing seagulls paused mid-flight to reconsider their priorities. It was the smell of soup. Not just any soup. Not thin, salty soldier soup. Not the kind priests served during purification fasts. No, this was a soup of mystery, of secrets, of onions so soft they surrendered their opinions. A soup whispered about in taverns, hinted at in poems, and once blamed, completely unfairly, for the sinking of an entire ship. Our tale begins in the kitchen of an inn called the Sleepy Gorgon, where a woman named Thalia stirred a pot that had been bubbling for 3 days straight. Thalia was not a hero. She was a soup witch, not by magic, by talent. Her soups were known across 6 villages and 1 minor oracle outpost for their uncanny ability to 1. Heal minor heartbreak, 2. Induce very specific dreams, 3. Reveal forgotten family recipes through taste alone. She stirred clockwise, always. Added ingredients without measuring. Whispered to bay leaves before dropping them in. And on this day, she was preparing her most famous creation, sea-steeped stew of seafaring serenity. The recipe was old, older than olives. Older, some claimed, than Zeus's first beard. It contained mussels harvested under a new moon leaks, sliced only at dawn, wine reduced until it whispered one single, mysterious spice no one could ever name. Only feel, and it was this soup. This comforting, sloshy, mildly prophetic broth that would eventually be blamed for the loss of the drifting fig, a merchant ship bound for Thessaly. But let's not skip ahead. Let's breathe in first. Imagine it. That kitchen, that aroma. Steam coiling upward, kissing the low rafters, brushing against bundles of drying thyme and garlic. Thalia's apron dusted with flour, her hair tied back with twine, her hands moving slowly, as if dancing with the wooden spoon. Outside the inn, sailors argued about the price of sea salt. A donkey sang a haunting solo. Somewhere, a lute tried and failed to hit a minor seventh. And inside, magic, not flashy magic, not glowing or cursed into frogs. Just soup, soulful, layered, unreasonably warm. Thalia hummed as she stirred. She didn't care for stories of gods or wars. She believed in simmering, in soft things, in the way a stew could carry memory better than a lyre. Which is why, when a group of rowdy sailors burst in asking for a meal worthy of Poseidon's lunchbox, she simply ladled the soup into clay bowls and said, "Careful, this one brings dreams." They laughed, ate, laughed again, then went silent, because something happened with every bite. Memories rose, not dramatic ones, just small ones. The smell of their mother's fish cakes, the feeling of bare feet on cold dock planks, the time they cried after dropping a fig tart into the sea. And so they wept, politely, in a manly way. One of them tried to blame the onions. Another mumbled something about saltwater allergies. A third pretended to be tasting sea ghosts. Thalia said nothing. She only smiled and refilled their bowls. Later that evening, the captain of the drifting fig approached her. He was tall, stern, wore a hat too large for his head. "Whatever you put in that pot," he said, voice low. "I haven't felt this calm in years." Thalia nodded. "You needed stillness." "I don't like stillness," he muttered. "Makes the sea too quiet." She wiped her hands. "Then take some for the road. The storm is due tomorrow. Best to sail with something warm inside." He hesitated, then took a clay jar she handed him, sealed with wax and wrapped in cloth. "For courage?" he asked. She shook her head. "For remembrance." And so, that's how it began. Not with lightning, not with wrath, with a bowl of soup, and a whisper of warmth passed from hand to hand. "Now close your eyes. Let the scent find you." A hint of fennel, a note of brine, the rich hum of garlic softened in oil. Let it lull you. Because before the storm, before the sinking, before the song the wind would sing that no one would forget, there was soup. The sea was calm the next morning. Too calm. It lay still like a silver tablecloth, stretched taut and expectant, as if it knew something and was trying not to say it. Not yet. Aboard the drifting fig, the mood was oddly sentimental. Gone were the usual pre-sail grunts and elbow jabs, the loud gambling over who'd catch the first flying fish, or who would vomit first off the port side. Instead, the crew moved slowly. One sailor spent 5 whole minutes tying and readying a knot that didn't really need tying. Another stared at the horizon like it had just insulted his grandfather. Even the ship's cat, a notorious gremlin named Vinegar, curled quietly in a coil of rope and refused to hiss at anyone. And below deck, the jar of soup sat nestled in a crate of cloth scraps and gently clinking spoons. Still warm, still humming. Captain Leandros, in his oversized hat and weather-worn boots, stood at the helm, thumb brushing the wax seal of the jar in his coat pocket. He didn't know why he kept touching it. It wasn't magical. It hadn't glowed. No riddles had whispered from the broth. But something in him wanted to keep it close, just in case. Now, it should be said, the Drifting Fig was not a particularly famous ship. It was known for 3 things. 1. Delivering figs, olives, and the occasional suspicious amphora of aged fish paste no one ever opened. 2. having a mast that creaked in iambic pentameter. 3. And now, of course, the soup. As the ship pushed off from the sleepy dock, Thalia stood at the edge of the water, apron blowing softly in the breeze, ladle still in hand. She didn't wave. She just nodded once and whispered, "Stew safely." On board, the wind picked up. Sails caught it like yawns. The crew busied themselves with rigging, navigation, and pretending not to cry into their sleeves. But something followed them. Not a storm. Not yet. A feeling. The kind of quiet that wraps around your ribs and makes you remember every name you've ever forgotten. That night, under a dome of stars so clear it made the deck glow, the captain finally opened the jar. He did it slowly, privately, crouched behind a stack of cargo. He just wanted a taste. Just a spoonful. And as the lid came off, the scent spilled out like a memory too big to hold in your chest. It was deeper now, more complex, richer than before. A note of anchovy, a breath of cinnamon, a sigh of something not quite sorrow, not quite peace. He dipped a spoon and tasted. And suddenly, he remembered the day his brother left for war. Not the goodbye, not the speech. The soup. The soup their mother had made. Thick with lentils, too much cumin, and that burnt patch at the bottom she always pretended was intentional browning. He tasted it now. All of it. That day. That warmth. That ache. And he wept. Just a little. Then sealed the jar. Because too much of that kind of memory? You might forget you're on a boat at all. Up above, the crew played dice by lantern light. One of them was humming something unfamiliar. A tune they swore they'd never heard before. But everyone seemed to know. Back in the galley, the cook stared at his ladle, feeling slightly offended that no one had asked for his stew that night. "I put raisins in it," he muttered. For texture, the soup from Thalia, meanwhile, sat in its jar. Still, calm, smiling in that strange way only soup can, silently, warmly, knowingly. And miles behind, at the sleepy Gorgon, Thalia was already stirring a new pot. Not the same recipe. This one was for grief. She always knew which soup to start before the need arrived. And soon it would be needed. But not yet. For now, the drifting fig sailed smoothly, moonlight painting silver across its wake. The sea was still quiet, but it was listening. They say the sea doesn't speak, but it listens. And that night, as the drifting fig cut gently through sleeping waves, the sea was listening harder than usual. The sails barely fluttered. The wind moved like a whisper through a closed door. Even the rigging ropes, usually creaking and groaning like tired knees, stayed silent. Below deck, the jar of soup breathed. Not audibly, not visibly, but if you stood near it long enough, you'd feel it. Like warmth where there shouldn't be any. Like a sigh that hadn't been released yet. Captain Leandros lay in his hammock, hands behind his head, staring at the low wooden ceiling as though it might blink back. He hadn't slept. Every time his eyes began to close, that flavor returned. That feeling, not of danger, but of slowness, of being caught in a memory that didn't belong entirely to him. He sat up and reached for the jar again. Just one more spoonful, he told himself. Just enough to take the edge off whatever this was. He didn't realize the cook had woken too. The two men met in the galley, startled but calm. The cook, whose name was Melitos and who insisted on adding raisins to nearly everything, looked at the jar, then at the captain. "Still warm?" he asked. Leandros nodded. They sat at the bench and opened it together. This time they shared. 1 spoon each. 2. Silence stretching between them like steam. Melitos closed his eyes. "I dreamed of garlic once," he said quietly. "That's how I became a cook." Leandros raised an eyebrow. "You had a garlic dream?" "Not just garlic," Melitos said. "Garlic roasting with onions. In butter. During a storm. I woke up crying and made soup before sunrise." The captain considered this. "This is like that," he said, gesturing to the jar. "Only I feel like the soup dreamed of me." They laughed. Softly, without knowing why. Above them, clouds gathered. Not loudly, not in a rush. Just slowly, with intent. Back on deck, Eurylochus, ever anxious, stood watch with his arms folded tightly, staring into the dark. He had the sense something was changing. A ripple in the water where there should have been calm. A scent of time in the air that didn't belong. A silence that felt circular, like waiting for something to return to its beginning. And somewhere inside the ship, the soup began to shift. Not in volume, not in form, but in presence. It was no longer just a meal. It was an anchor to something deeper, older, hungrier. By dawn, the sky had turned the color of overripe plums. Heavy, dull, ready to burst. The crew didn't speak much during breakfast. Melitos offered oat cakes and dried cherries. No one mentioned the soup, but every man glanced toward the storage room, where the jar now sat covered with a cloth. The wind changed direction at midday. Sails flapped, birds disappeared, and then, around twilight, they saw it. A shadow on the horizon. Not a storm exactly. Not yet. A line. A wall. Dark as sleep. Wide as the end of a sentence. Reef? Asked one sailor. No reef, Leandros said. That sky and sea holding hands too tightly. He meant it as a joke. No one laughed. Back below deck, the jar hummed. This time truly. Low. Soft. Like the bass note of a lullaby sung by a tide. Melitos placed a hand on the lid. It knows, he whispered. Knows what? Asked Eurylochus, peeking in. That the ship won't reach Thessaly. There it was. Said out loud. Said too soon. The storm struck just past the evening bell. Not a crash. Not a roar. A pull. Like the sea reached up and tugged the ship down by the ankles. Rain fell sideways. The sky fractured. The mast bent like a reed and screamed. Leandros shouted orders no one heard. Sails tore. Ropes snapped. The wheel spun free. And below, in the storage room, the jar of soup tipped sideways. The lid held, but the cloth fell away. And for a single, impossible moment, everything paused. The crew would later swear, some in jest, others with fear, that just before the ship cracked, just before the sea swallowed the stern, just before the world turned to salt and foam, they smelled it. The soup. Warm. Spiced. Full of fennel and sorrow. Then the waves claimed them. But not all. Because soup, when made well, always leaves something behind. The sea, after swallowing the drifting fig, did what it always does. It calmed. The storm vanished as if embarrassed. The winds tucked themselves away behind distant cliffs. And the sun, rude in its normalcy, rose the next morning like nothing had happened. Debris bobbed lazily in the waves. A spoon. A crate of raisins, untouched. A single sandal, drifting proudly in circles like it had made its own survival plan. And on a small strip of pebbled shore, damp and coughing and smelling faintly of thyme and seaweed, lay Captain Leandros. He sat up slowly, blinked against the light, and reached for his coat. It wasn't there, but the jar was. Not the whole jar, no. The clay had cracked. The wax seal had split. But inside, tucked against the remaining curve of ceramic, sat a warm pool of soup. Still warm. Still humming. He laughed. Because what else could he do? He cradled it, stared out at the horizon, and whispered, it was the soup. Later that day, as waves lapped the shore like soft applause, a second figure washed up, Melitos, the cook. Face down, clutching a ladle. Alive. Barely. He woke to the scent of broth, the sound of birds, and the captain offering him a spoonful. You saved it. Melitos rasped. No, Leandros replied. It saved us. They ate in silence. Because now it wasn't just soup. It was the last thing left. Over the following days, more survivors arrived. One by one, coughing, shivering, blinking at the sun like confused potatoes. And each time, Leandros would greet them with a sip from the jar, still warm somehow, always enough. Some believed the soup was magical. Others believed it was cursed. Eurylochus, found tangled in a fishing net with a seagull sitting on his head, simply whispered, it tastes like home. And perhaps that's what it was all along. Not magic, just memory, distilled and served hot. Back in the town of sleepy chimneys and cracked tiles, Thalia stirred a new pot. She had known, somehow. The moment the storm began, her hand changed direction. From clockwise to still. The stew waited. And when the tide finally brought the shattered pieces of her old clay jar back to shore, days later, nestled among driftwood and sea glass, she gathered them gently, dried them in the sun, and placed them on a shelf. People asked what they were. Reminders, she said. No one pressed further. But from that day on, her soups changed. They became quieter, less dramatic. She stopped adding the mysterious spice. And once a month, without fail, she made a pot of sea-steeped stew of seafaring serenity and left a single bowl outside her door, just in case the sea came calling. Now pause with me. Let your thoughts float like olive oil on broth. Let your breath slow, steam-like, into the coolness of this tale. Because this wasn't a story of loss. Not entirely. It was a story of warmth. Of what stays behind when everything else sinks. Of a captain who carried a spoon instead of a sword. And a cook who dreamed of garlic during a storm. And a soup that didn't save the world, but saved a few quiet souls who needed something warm to hold on to. Weeks passed. The survivors of the drifting fig built a small shelter along the shoreline where they'd landed. Just a scattering of driftwood huts and half-buried crates turned into benches. They called the place Stew Bay, not because of the soup itself, but because everything about it felt steeped in salt, in memory, in stories they couldn't quite stop telling. Each night, around a small fire, the crew would gather. They'd sit on crates, gnaw old biscuits, sip from coconut shells, and speak in low voices, not of storms or sails or sea monsters, but of that stew, of the moment it was handed to them after the wreck. The warmth of it, the steadiness, the quiet sound it made in the bowl, more breath than boil. "Best thing I ever tasted," said one man, stirring seawater into a lump of grain and pretending it was broth. "You say that about anything," Melitos muttered. "True," the man replied, "but this time I mean it." Captain Leandro sat apart, as he often did now. Not distant, just softer. He'd lost his ship, his maps, his hat, but the spoon? He still had it. He wore it tucked in his belt like a dagger. When asked why, he'd smile and say, "This one's better for saving lives." The spoon was cracked, burnished, smelled faintly of garlic and fig leaves. He cleaned it every day, not because it needed cleaning, but because it gave him something to hold. Eventually, word of the shipwrecks spread across the islands. Most people blamed the storm. Some blamed fate. A few blamed raisins. But the story that stuck, the one that made its way through ports and taverns and dreamy lullabies whispered on balconies, was different. It said that a soup sank a ship, that it was too good, too calming, too full of memory, that the sailors became so sleepy, so stirred by emotions, so wrapped in thoughts of mothers and lost socks and songs sung long ago, that they forgot to steer. And maybe, in a way, that's true. Not because the soup had magic, but because it had meaning. Because it asked them to feel things they'd ignored. And that's dangerous. Feeling things, I mean. When you're always sailing forward, always pushing through storms and salt and screaming winds, pausing to feel is the most daring thing you can do. And so the story grew. Thalia, of course, never confirmed or denied any of it. She kept stirring. She opened a second kitchen, closer to the shore this time. Called it the Drifted Ladle. Travelers came from far away, asking for the soup that dreams. She'd serve them something warm, hand them a spoon, and ask, "What do you want to remember?" Some answered. Some cried. Some just closed their eyes. Once, a young woman with storm-gray eyes asked for something that tastes like goodbye. Thalia handed her a bowl of lentil and lemon. No one knows what happened next. And so, that brings us to you. Lying here, breathing soft, warmed by stories, rocked by rhythm. You don't need a bowl right now. You don't need salt or fennel or steam. You just need the feeling. That soft, quiet hum at the bottom of your chest. That memory you didn't know was waiting. The one that says, "You're still here." Let that settle. Let it steam gently in the corners of your mind. Let it remind you that even shipwrecks can end with spoons, and warmth, and soup. Chapter 6. The melody that melted a temple. Good evening, friend. Settle back. You've traveled far. Through fig tarts and wooden horses. Through lutes and legends. Through shipwrecks and soup. And now, just one more story before we rest completely. This one is about a melody. A soft one. Forgettable at first. The kind that slips past your ear like a breeze that's in no hurry. But in time, it would bring an entire temple to its knees. Not with violence. Not with gods. But with music. Let me take you to Delos. A small island. Sacred. Revered. Birthplace of Apollo, god of music, poetry, prophecy, and occasionally, petty competitions. Delos was not loud. Not like Athens, with its endless debate and drama. It was gentle. Its streets were quiet in the way libraries are quiet. Every footstep sounding like a question. The temple at its center was vast, white, humming with sunlight. Inside, priests lit incense. Tourists, yes, even back then, they existed. whispered prayers and purchased figurines made of clay and good intentions. And outside, on the edge of the island, sat a man named Theron, a musician, kind of. He played a hollow pipe, not the grand double-reeded aulos the temple musicians used, not the lyre favored by Apollo himself. No, Theron's pipe was made from a hollow olive branch and a few carved holes, slightly crooked, like it had been crafted during a nap. He played for no one. He played for goats, and the goats were ambivalent. But Theron didn't mind. He wasn't after glory. He played because the air asked him to. He played slowly, softly, no rhythm, no plan, just breath through wood, shaping something not quite a song and not quite silence. Most people ignored him. Some dropped coins. Others shook their heads and said things like, "Apollo help him." But one day, something changed. Not for Theron, for the temple. Inside, a statue of Apollo, a grand thing made of bronze and pride, began to crack. No one noticed at first. It was just a line. A little hair-thin thread down the god's left calf. Could have been heat. Could have been time. Could have been the wind. But it wasn't. It was Theron. The melody, you see, it had started to hum. Not in pitch. Not in tone. In stone. Priests walked the halls at dusk and swore they heard a note. Not sung. Leaking. From the pillars. From the floor. From the shadows under Apollo's outstretched lyre. Theron, of course, had no idea. He was down at the beach playing to a particularly stubborn sea snail. He didn't play songs. He played moods. That morning, he had played, woke up late, and forgot sandals. Yesterday he'd played, accidentally stared at the sun. He'd once tried to play emotional regret after too much lentil stew. But the pipe broke halfway through, and he considered that a review. Back in the temple, cracks multiplied. The priests panicked. They blamed birds. They blamed poor construction. They blamed a visiting merchant who had spoken ill of olive oil. No one blamed Theron. Until one day, the high priest, walking along the northern corridor, heard a single, clear note. It rose like mist, fell like memory, sat in the chest like a gentle fist. And it made the statue weep. Just a little. Just enough for the priest to say, "Oh no." So, they followed the sound. Past the shrines. Past the grape cellars. Past the dog that always barked at reflections. To Theron, sitting cross-legged, eyes half closed, pipe in hand, a melody winding into the wind like loose thread. They watched. He didn't notice. Then the high priest asked, "What are you playing?" Theron blinked. "Nothing. That's not nothing." Theron shrugged. "It's not something either. It's just what the air asked for." And that's when the priest understood something that frightened him. This wasn't music meant to entertain. This was music meant to unravel. Let that thought settle now. Close your eyes. Imagine the island. The wind. The priest's stunned silence. The statue behind him cracking just a little more. And a man playing music not for glory, but for quiet. The high priest of Delos stood very still. Not in reverence. Not in awe. In confusion. Theron's music didn't make sense. It wasn't fast, or grand, or even intentional. It wandered, drifted. It sounded like a story being told backward by someone who kept forgetting the plot. But the stone had cracked, and the priests had rules about cracked stone. So they did what anyone would do when faced with mysterious vibrations and public responsibility. They held a meeting. 16 priests gathered in the basilica, each wearing identical robes and entirely different sandals. Some were young and very sure. Others were old and very tired. One was mostly here for the snacks. They debated. "Music cannot crack marble," one insisted, nibbling a sesame biscuit. "Then explain the weeping statue," said another, arms crossed dramatically. "It might be condensation," muttered the eldest, who hadn't truly listened to anything since the reign of King Tethrios and thought all music was just noise with ambition. Eventually, a decision was made. Theron must stop playing. Not arrested, not punished, just asked, formally, politely, with just enough authority to make it clear that joy was being monitored. The youngest priest was sent. He wore a wreath and carried a scroll. He found Theron seated on a smooth rock near the water's edge, playing what sounded suspiciously like, "I dropped my spoon and now I'm sad." The priest cleared his throat. Theron looked up, mid-note. "Yes?" he asked, not stopping. "We request, humbly but firmly, that you cease your playing within earshot of the temple." Theron squinted. "Because The priest shifted. The statue is sweating. Theron blinked. From my music? That's the prevailing theory. Theron shrugged. I didn't know bronze could sweat. It shouldn't. Oh. He plucked a sour note. The priest winced. Also, the priest added quickly, you've been attracting attention. It was true. Not a crowd. Not yet. But passers-by had started lingering. Children sat cross-legged in the sand. An old fisherwoman claimed the tune cured her hiccups. One man said he remembered his own name more clearly after hearing it played in B-flat melancholy. Theron sighed. I'm not trying to attract anything, he said. I'm just listening. To what? The island. The priest frowned. Delos speaks. Theron nodded. Not in words. In rhythm. He played a few notes, simple, light, soft as sea spray. The priest almost forgot his mission. Almost. But duty tugged at him like a persistent sandal strap. I must ask you to stop. Theron didn't argue. He just stopped, put the pipe down, folded his hands, and stared at the waves. The priest left, scroll unopened, feeling like he'd interrupted a story mid-sentence. Back at the temple, the statue didn't crack further, but the silence rang louder than any note. For 3 days, Theron didn't play. He didn't speak much, either. He walked. He listened. He tried to hum, but the tune wouldn't come. Something in him had unraveled, and now didn't know how to re-braid itself. Meanwhile, in the temple, something odd happened. People stopped coming. Not completely, but the flow slowed. Visitors lingered outside, sat on the steps, stared at the sea. They said things like, it's too quiet. And, I swear I heard something last time. And, wasn't there music here once? The priests held another meeting. This one was shorter. No biscuits. Just one question. Had the music become part of the place? And if so, what happens when you silence a part of the place? They didn't have an answer. But that evening, the eldest priest, he of eye rolls and raisin skepticism, walked down to the shore. He sat beside Theron, said nothing for a while, then asked, can you play again? Theron didn't answer. Instead, he picked up his pipe, brushed off a bit of sand, and played one note. Just one. Low. Uncertain. Like a door slowly opening. And the wind exhaled. Now breathe with it. Let that note sit in your chest. Let the silence that followed press gently against your ribs. Because something is returning. And sometimes, a story continues not with a bang, but with breath. Theron's pipe had been quiet for 3 days. Now, with one soft, hesitant note, the world seemed to lean in. Not dramatically, not with lightning or choral gasps. Just gently, like a listener who'd been waiting outside the door, unsure if they were welcome. The eldest priest, still sitting beside him on the shoreline, closed his eyes. He hadn't expected much. Honestly, he'd thought this entire thing was a dramatic misunderstanding caused by sunstroke and too many olives. But that single note, it was different. Not beautiful, not skilled, but honest. It sounded like someone remembering how to speak after years of polite silence. Theron didn't rush. He waited. The wind shifted. The gulls quieted. Even the sea stopped smacking the rocks for a moment, like a bored child suddenly interested. Then another note. A third. A pause. He wasn't playing a song. He was searching, and the island answered. A leaf blew past in rhythm. A pebble fell from a ledge in perfect time. A distant donkey brayed, surprisingly in key. And somewhere inside the temple, deep in its white marble ribs, the faintest sound echoed. A soft, bell-like tone, like stone remembering music it had once known. The priest opened his eyes. He didn't say anything. He just nodded once and stood, slow as dusk. Theron kept playing. The next day, 3 visitors arrived at the temple steps before sunrise. They didn't knock. They didn't pray. They sat, waited, listened. Theron didn't disappoint. He sat on the same rock, played the same pipe, and let the day unfold through notes that weren't really notes and songs that never repeated. By sunset, there were 7 listeners. By the end of the week, there were 23. No signs. No announcements. Just people, drawn like dust to a sunbeam. And the temple? The cracks stopped spreading. They didn't close, but they didn't widen either. Priests stopped blaming birds. They started humming. Theron didn't speak to the crowd. He didn't sell scrolls or pose for mosaics. He just played. Until one morning, something new happened. He arrived at his usual spot and found someone waiting. A girl, barefoot, no older than 10, holding a pipe of her own, badly carved. uneven holes, tied with a ribbon that looked like it had once belonged to a festival tunic. She sat beside him without a word. Theron glanced at her, nodded, and together they played. Horribly at first. She squeaked. He adjusted. She laughed. He added a note just to match her giggle. And somewhere between mistake and melody, they made something new. A song that had never existed before. That never would again. The kind you feel more than hear. And the crowd? They didn't cheer. They didn't clap. They just breathed deeper. Because that's what real music does. It doesn't perform. It allows. By that evening, another child had joined them. Then a baker. Then an old sailor who claimed he once kissed a harpy and wrote songs about it. Theron never led. He just played, and listened, and followed. Back at the temple, a priest stood before the statue of Apollo and said, "We've misjudged what worship looks like." Another nodded. "We've mistaken silence for peace." And the third simply whispered, "Maybe music isn't meant to praise. Maybe it's meant to remind." Now, pause with me here. Let that thought ring in your ribs. A reminder, not a performance. A sound that says, you were here. You mattered. And not because you shouted, but because you listened. By midsummer, people were calling it the whispering hour. Each evening, just as the lights softened and the shadows stretched themselves long and lazy across the marble, Theron would sit beside the sea with his crooked pipe. And others would join. Not just musicians. Not just children. All sorts. A tired fisherman with calloused hands and one working ear. A woman who hadn't spoken in 7 years, but hummed as she wove baskets. A philosopher who insisted everything was illusion, then cried when someone played 4 notes that reminded him of figs and sunlight. There was no stage, no script, just space. And in that space, music formed like mist over cool stone. Some played well, others played terribly, but no one judged, because the point was never performance. It was presence. The temple priests began to attend in secret. At first, they stayed hidden behind columns and tried not to smile. Then they brought stools, then blankets, then instruments. One priest, notorious for falling asleep during sermons, composed a tune that made birds land on his shoulders. They called it Feather Lullaby. And the statue of Apollo? It changed, not in shape, not in structure, but in feeling. The cracks glowed faintly at dusk, not with light, but with warmth. A kind of hum, a slow exhale, like marble remembering how to be listened to. One day, a merchant from Corinth arrived. He'd heard rumors of a temple that melted, of a man who made statues weep. He came with silver, scribes, and a proposition. "I'll build a theater," he declared. "Right here on the cliff. Marble seats. Columns. A roof shaped like a lyre." He meant well, but Theron declined. "We already have what we need," he said, gesturing to the stone, the breeze, the curve of sand where tide met toe. The merchant didn't understand, but the priest did. "We've spent years telling people what to believe," the priest said. "Perhaps it's time we learn how to listen." And so, the whispering hour remained simple. No tickets, no praise, just people, breathing in tune. And across the island, other things began to soften. Old arguments ended mid-sentence. Markets lowered their voices. Even the goats stopped head-butting each other quite so dramatically. The melody had seeped in, not as a song, as a permission, to feel, to fumble, to sit in silence and not fill it with cleverness. Theron never claimed to be a teacher, but people learned anyway. How to hear each other, how to make mistakes with grace, how to leave space between notes. And sometimes, that's the hardest part of music, knowing when not to play. Theron once said, to no one in particular, "Music isn't what fills the air. It's what happens when the air listens back." Now rest in that. Let your breath fall quiet. Let your thoughts come slowly. Because this music, it doesn't demand attention. It waits. And the waiting is where the temple begins to melt. Years passed. Delos changed, but not loudly. The temple still stood, cracked, humming, softened. Visitors still came, not for spectacle, but for stillness. And Theron? He played less often. Not because he grew tired, but because others had learned. There were new pipers now, new voices, new silences worth keeping. The little girl who once squeaked her way through a tune of her own sorrow now taught others how to carve their own crooked pipes. The old sailor had composed a piece called "Waiting for a Boat That Already Sank," and claimed it could fix a broken heart or at least make it ache with better rhythm. Even the priests adapted. One by one, they let go of certain ceremonies. They shortened the chants. They opened the doors at dusk and told visitors, "Sit. Listen." That's all. They stopped offering answers. They started offering time. And so, it became legend. That once, long ago, a melody too soft to notice cracked a temple made of marble and pride. That no one could remember the tune, but everyone remembered how they felt when they heard it. Warm, seen, safe. Theron, in the end, didn't fade. He just returned. To the hills, to the breeze, to the hum between goat bleats and flute notes and forgotten names whispered into the wind. Some say he became part of the island. That his pipe still plays when the wind moves just right through the olive groves. That if you listen near the temple steps at dusk, you'll hear four notes, unfinished, unhurried, waiting for someone to answer. And so now, dear dreamer, it's your turn to answer, not with song, necessarily, but with stillness, with breath, with presence. Let your own mind drift back to that quiet hill, to that cracked statue, to a man with a crooked pipe who played not to be heard, but to remember. Let yourself exhale, gently, like a note left unfinished on purpose. And if you hear something tonight, just outside your window, in the hush of the room, in the space between thoughts, it might just be him, asking, softly, what do you need to feel to finally fall asleep? May these stories, these strange old myths, these sleepy moments, guide you now into peaceful dreams. If you drifted off during this long lullaby, let me know below. Tap like, subscribe, only if it feels right. And now, we rest. Good night. Whispers. This has been Boring Greek Myths for Sleep. Sleep well, dear listener.